On the day Margaret Johnson turned 80, the silence in her own home became deafening. The absence of her children, David and Emily, turned the celebration into a suffocating void. But what she didn't know was that this would be the least of her worries. Behind closed curtains and false smiles, dark secrets were about to explode, threatening to destroy the life of a woman who believed she had built a solid family. Overhearing a conversation she was never meant to hear, Margaret realizes her home is a minefield of lies and betrayal. What should have been a quiet evening of celebration becomes the start of a deadly game where every wrong move could be fatal. But as the truth begins to surface, the only question left is, who will survive the chaos that's about to unfold? The late autumn sun cast a soft glow through the windows of Margaret Johnson's modest home, illuminating the room with a warmth that belied the chill outside. It was her 80th birthday, a milestone she had once imagined would be filled with laughter, family, and love. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, 3 p.m., and sighed. There had been no calls from her son David or his Margaret, with her neatly brushed silver hair and soft blue cardigan, sat at the small dining table she had set the night before. She had spent hours preparing her favorite dish, a traditional pot roast, and carefully arranging the plates, hoping David and Emily would show up for dinner. She had even baked her famous apple pie, the one David used to love as a child. As the minutes dragged on, Margaret's excitement dwindled. By 4 p.m., she began to worry. Maybe they were just running late, she told herself, refusing to let disappointment settle in. She picked up her old rotary phone, staring at it for a moment before dialing David's number. The line rang several times before his voice finally answered, curt and hurried. "Mom, what is it?" David asked, his tone devoid of warmth. "I was just wondering if you and Emily were still coming by for dinner." "It's my birthday, and I thought we could—" Margaret's voice trembled slightly, the unspoken hope lingering in the air. "Oh, right. Look, Mom, we're busy. We've got a lot going on today. I didn't forget, but we'll see about stopping by later." "Emily's not feeling well," David replied, sounding distracted. Before Margaret could respond, the line went dead. She stood there for a moment, holding the phone to her ear long after the call had ended, a knot forming in her chest. Busy. Too busy to visit on her birthday. A hollow ache settled in as she realized that David and Emily weren't coming. Sighing, Margaret put the phone down gently. Her hands trembled as she walked back to the dining table, looking at the meal she had prepared with so much love. The silence of the house felt deafening. Margaret sank into a chair, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. She had always been strong, always put on a brave face. But this abandonment cut deeper than she had expected. As she sat there trying to gather herself, a faint sound drifted from the kitchen. Voices. Curious, Margaret stood and walked quietly toward the source of the noise. The voices became clearer, Emily's sharp, biting tone unmistakable. "I don't understand why she thinks she needs all this attention," Emily was saying, her voice carrying through the thin walls. Margaret's heart sank as she realized Emily must have forgotten her cell phone was still on speaker. "She's always so needy, expecting us to drop everything for her. It's exhausting." Margaret felt the sting of Emily's words like a slap. She had never wanted to be a burden. She had raised David alone after his father passed, giving him everything she had, even when it meant sacrificing her own happiness. And now, on her 80th birthday, this was how she was seen. Needy. "I know," David's voice chimed in, though it lacked the venom of Emily's, "but it's her birthday. We should have done something at least." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, fighting back the sob that threatened to escape. How could her own son talk about her like this? The boy she had loved and nurtured, the man she had watched grow, now seemed like a stranger. The hurt swelled in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Unable to bear any more, Margaret quietly stepped back into the dining room. Her heart shattered. The table, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a mockery. She could no longer sit and wait for them. She needed to leave this house, this loneliness, and the suffocating realization that she was no longer needed. Without much thought, Margaret gathered her coat and scarf, her movements stiff and mechanical. She grabbed her purse, her hands shaking as she picked up the small framed photo of her and David, taken when he was just a boy. They had been so close back then, inseparable, but now that bond felt irreparably broken. Just as she was about to step outside, the door creaked open behind her. David stood there, his expression tired, as though he was doing her a favor by showing up at all. Emily stood a few feet behind him, her arms crossed, clearly not wanting to be there. "Mum, what's with the bag?" David asked, his voice flat. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, her eyes full of the unshed tears she'd been holding back for hours. "I'm leaving, David," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I can't stay here any longer." "Leaving? Where are you going to go?" David asked, his tone sharp, almost mocking. "You don't have anywhere else to go. Why don't you just, I don't know, enjoy the streets or something?" His words, spoken so carelessly, were the final blow. Margaret felt the last bit of her heart break, the bond between mother and son snapping like a brittle thread. She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Turning away from David, Margaret walked out the door and into the crisp autumn air. The evening had settled in, the cool breeze biting against her skin. As she stood outside her own home, she realized that everything had changed in those few short moments. She was no longer welcome in the life she had built, the family she had raised, but she wasn't defeated, not yet. With a heavy heart and uncertain steps, Margaret began walking down the quiet suburban street, her mind racing. There was one person she could turn to, Laura, her old friend. Maybe Laura would understand. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a new beginning there. As the sky darkened and the streetlights flickered on, Margaret disappeared into the night, leaving behind the remnants of a family that no longer seemed to want her. Margaret Johnson's steps felt heavier than the small suitcase in her hand as she made her way down the quiet suburban street. The evening sky had fully darkened, and a biting wind cut through her thin coat, chilling her to the bone. Yet, despite the cold, Margaret pressed on, her mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. Her son's words echoed painfully in her ears, "Enjoy the streets." How could David say something so heartless? She had never imagined a day where she would be walking away from her own family, from the life she had spent decades building. Yet here she was, cast aside on her 80th birthday. The betrayal stung deep, not just from David, but from Emily as well. Margaret had always tried to get along with her daughter-in-law, even when Emily's coldness and criticism made it difficult. But overhearing Emily mock her earlier that day had pushed Margaret to a breaking point. The streets were mostly empty now, with only the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves accompanying her. She walked slowly but deliberately toward the only place she could think to go, Laura's house. Laura Thompson had been Margaret's closest friend for nearly 40 years. They had met in their early 40s, two single mothers trying to navigate the challenges of raising children on their own. While their sons had grown apart over the years, Margaret and Laura remained as close as ever. Margaret knew that if anyone could understand her pain, it would be Laura. After what felt like an eternity, Margaret finally turned onto Laura's street. The familiar old Victorian house, with its warm lights glowing from within, stood like a beacon in the darkness. Margaret hesitated for a moment at the gate, her pride battling with the desperate need for comfort. She had never been one to ask for help, not even in her most difficult times. But now, the weight of her son's rejection was too much to bear alone. Taking a deep breath, Margaret approached the door and rang the bell. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing Laura's warm, concerned face. "Margaret?" Laura's voice was soft, filled with both surprise and worry. "What are you doing here at this hour? Is everything okay?" Margaret tried to smile, but the exhaustion and heartbreak etched across her face told the real story. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice trembling. I left David's house. I couldn't stay there any longer." Laura's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly stepped aside, ushering Margaret in. "Come inside, dear. It's freezing out there." She led Margaret into the cozy living room, where a fire crackled warmly in the fireplace. The scent of freshly brewed tea lingered in the air, and the soft glow of table lamps created a peaceful atmosphere. Margaret sat down on the plush sofa, feeling the warmth of the room slowly seep into her bones. Laura disappeared into the kitchen for a moment, returning with a cup of hot tea. "Drink this," she said, handing it to Margaret, "and then tell me everything." For a few moments, Margaret just sat there, cradling the warm cup in her hands. The reality of her situation hit her all at once, and tears that she had been holding back all day finally spilled over. Laura sat beside her, not saying a word, just offering the silent comfort that only a true friend could provide. When Margaret finally found her voice again, she recounted everything: the forgotten birthday, Emily's cruel words, David's cold indifference, and the final blow when he told her to enjoy the streets. Laura listened quietly, her face growing darker with each detail. "David said that?" Laura finally asked, her voice incredulous. "I can't believe he would say something like that to you." "I don't know what's happened to him," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "He's not the boy I raised. It's like I don't even know him anymore. And Emily, she's never liked me, but I didn't think she would go this far." Laura nodded slowly, her mind clearly racing. "You're staying here tonight," she said firmly. "There's no way I'm letting you go back to that house." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Laura held up a hand. "No arguments. You'll stay as long as you need to. You're like family to me, Margaret. We'll figure this out." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude wash over her. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to relax, knowing that she wasn't completely alone in this. Laura's home had always been a safe haven, and tonight it felt more like home than her own son's house ever had. As the fire crackled in the background, Laura leaned back, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know," she began slowly, "my brother Mark is coming to visit tomorrow." "Mark, the detective?" Margaret asked, surprised. She hadn't seen Laura's brother in years, not since he'd retired from his job as a private investigator. "Yes," Laura nodded. "He's been doing some consulting work since he retired, and he's been staying with me on and off while he works a case nearby. I think we should tell him about what's going on with David and Emily." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean? This isn't a crime, Laura. It's family. It's complicated." Laura shook her head. "No, Margaret, it's more than that. I've been getting a bad feeling about Emily for a long time. The way she's distanced David from you, the control she seems to have over him. Something's not right. And I think Mark might be able to help us figure out what's really going on." Margaret hesitated, unsure of how to feel. Could there really be something more behind Emily's coldness? Or was this just a case of a daughter-in-law not getting along with her mother-in-law? The idea of involving a detective in her family problems felt drastic, but deep down, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Laura might be right. "Do you really think there's something more going on?" Margaret asked quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. Laura met her gaze, her expression serious. "I do, and I think you deserve to know the truth." The thought of uncovering some hidden truth about her own family was terrifying. But after everything she had endured that night, Margaret felt a spark of resolve begin to grow inside her. She had been pushed aside, ignored, and disrespected by the very people she loved most. If there was something more to this, if Emily really was manipulating David in some way, Margaret needed to know. "Okay," Margaret said after a long pause, "let's talk to Mark. But Laura, I don't want this to tear the family apart any more than it already has." Laura nodded, placing a comforting hand on Margaret's arm. "We'll be careful, but we'll get to the bottom of this, I promise." As the two women sat together, the weight of the night began to lift ever so slightly. Margaret wasn't sure what the future held or if she would ever reconcile with David, but for now, she wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the strength to fight for the truth. The early morning light filtered through the curtains of Laura's living room, casting soft shadows on the floor. Margaret hadn't slept well. The events of the previous day played over and over in her mind. The coldness of David, the cruel words of Emily, and the feeling of abandonment that still clung to her like a weight she couldn't shake. She was grateful to Laura for taking her in, but a part of her still struggled to come to terms with the fact that she was no longer welcome in her own son's home. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in her hands, Margaret stared blankly at the steam rising from the mug. She heard the front door open, followed by the sound of voices. Laura's brother, Mark, had arrived. "Margaret!" Laura called from the hallway. "Come in here. I want you to meet Mark again." Taking a deep breath, Margaret rose from the chair and walked toward the living room. There stood Mark Thompson, taller and more rugged than she remembered, with a sharpness in his eyes that hinted at years of experience as a detective. His graying hair and the lines on his face made him appear weathered. But there was an alertness about him that Margaret instantly trusted. "Margaret," Mark greeted her with a warm smile, stepping forward to shake her hand. "It's been a while." "It has," Margaret replied, trying to return the smile. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," Mark said, glancing at Laura. "Laura told me a little about what's been going on, but I'd like to hear it from you." They sat down in the living room, and Margaret recounted everything: her 80th birthday, the coldness of her son, and the way Emily had mocked her. Mark listened intently, his expression unreadable, but Margaret could see his mind working, piecing together the details of her story. When Margaret finished, Mark leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "It's not uncommon for family dynamics to shift when a son gets married," he began carefully, "but this feels off. You said David has been distant for a while now." Margaret nodded. "Yes, ever since he married Emily, he's changed. He used to call me every day, visit often. But now, it's like I don't even exist." "And Emily?" Mark asked. "What do you know about her?" "Not much, honestly," Margaret admitted. "She's always been polite, but distant, and lately, well, you heard what she said. She clearly doesn't want me around." Mark exchanged a glance with Laura, his face growing serious. "I've seen situations like this before. A spouse, usually someone like Emily, comes into the picture and slowly isolates their partner from their family. It starts small, like cutting off regular visits or creating tension in the relationship. Before long, the spouse has complete control over the situation." Margaret's heart sank at his words. "Are you saying she's manipulating David?" "It's possible," Mark replied, his voice steady. "But manipulation alone isn't usually enough to cause such a drastic change in someone. There might be more going on here." "Do you know much about David's business?" Margaret frowned, shaking her head. "He's mentioned it a few times. He and his friend Jason started a company together. They've been working on some big project lately, but he never talks about the details." "Jason," Mark repeated thoughtfully. "What do you know about him?" "Not much," Margaret confessed. "David and Jason have been friends since college. They've always been close, but I never really got to know Jason. He's always been, I don't know, a little too slick for my liking." Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you think Jason could be involved in this, whatever this is?" Margaret hesitated. "I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had something to do with it." Laura, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Margaret, you've always had good instincts. If you think Jason's up to something, we should look into it." Mark nodded in agreement. "I can dig around, see what I can find on Emily and Jason. If they're involved in anything suspicious, it won't be hard to uncover." Margaret bit her lip, unsure of how to feel. On one hand, she wanted answers. She needed to understand why her son had pushed her away. But on the other hand, the thought of digging into David's life felt like a betrayal. She didn't want to destroy what little relationship she had left with him, no matter how strained it was. "Mark," Margaret said softly, I don't want this to hurt David. He's still my son. I understand, Mark replied gently, and I won't do anything to hurt him. But if Emily and Jason are up to something, you deserve to know the truth. David deserves to know too. Margaret nodded slowly. She didn't want to believe that her son was involved in anything shady, but if there was even the slightest chance that he was being manipulated, she had to know. All right, she said finally. Look into it, but please, be careful. Mark gave her a reassuring smile. I'll be discreet. You won't have to worry about a thing. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Margaret tried to keep herself busy, helping Laura with household chores and making small talk, but her mind kept drifting back to David. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that she had been blind to the truth for far too long. Later that evening, after dinner, Margaret retreated to the guest room Laura had prepared for her. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the darkened street outside. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. How had things come to this? How had her relationship with David deteriorated so completely? And what if Mark's suspicions were right? What if Emily and Jason were involved in something sinister? The thought made Margaret's stomach churn as she lay down, pulling the covers up to her chin. Margaret thought back to when David was a little boy. He had been so full of life, so loving and kind. She had always been proud of the man he had become, until now. The David she had seen yesterday was a stranger, and the thought that someone, Emily, might have changed him was almost too much to bear. Margaret closed her eyes, hoping that sleep would bring some relief from the turmoil inside her. But sleep didn't come easily. Instead, her mind kept replaying Mark's words, his warning about manipulation, and the possibility that Emily was behind all of this. The next morning, Margaret woke to the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the kitchen. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, finding Mark and Laura already seated at the table, deep in conversation. I made some calls last night, Mark said, as soon as Margaret sat down. Nothing concrete yet, but I've got a few leads I'm going to follow up on today. I'll be back later this afternoon. Margaret's heart quickened. The investigation had already begun, and there was no turning back now. She nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. Whatever you find, Margaret said quietly, I just hope David can forgive me. Mark met her gaze, his expression serious. Margaret, if I'm right about this, it's not you who needs forgiveness, it's David. As Mark left the house, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than they had anticipated. And whatever the truth was, it would change everything. The day stretched on, the quiet hum of life in Laura's house, a stark contrast to the turmoil that swirled inside Margaret's mind. She tried to focus on simple tasks, folding laundry, watering the plants, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Mark's words. What if Emily and Jason really were involved in something? What if David was in danger, and she had been too blinded by her love for him to see it? By early afternoon, Margaret found herself sitting by the living room window, staring out at the street. The world outside seemed so peaceful, with neighbors walking their dogs and children riding bicycles down the sidewalk. It was hard to believe that her own life had turned upside down, that beneath the surface of her son's success, there might be something much darker lurking. Laura entered the room, her hands full of folded linens. You're quiet today, she observed, setting the laundry on a chair nearby. I know this is hard for you, Margaret, but try not to worry too much. Mark's good at what he does. He'll find out the truth. Margaret nodded, but the weight of uncertainty still pressed down on her. I just don't understand how it all went so wrong, Laura, she said quietly. I raised David to be kind, to care about family. How could he have changed so much? Laura sighed, sitting down beside Margaret on the sofa. Sometimes people change, Margaret, especially when they get involved with the wrong crowd. You know, I've never trusted Emily, but I never thought she could have this kind of influence on David. I don't want to believe she's behind this, Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But if she is, what then? How do I get my son back? Laura placed a comforting hand on Margaret's arm. One step at a time. First, we need to know what's really going on. Then we can figure out how to help David. Before Margaret could respond, the front door creaked open, and Mark stepped inside, a grim expression on his face. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. Had he found something? Was the worst of her fears about to be confirmed? "Mark, you're back," Laura said, standing quickly. "Did you find anything?" Mark nodded, setting his jacket down and crossing the room to join them. He sat down, his face serious. "I made some calls, did a little digging. Nothing definitive yet, but I'm starting to get a clearer picture." Margaret held her breath, waiting for him to continue. "Emily doesn't have much of a financial history before she married David," Mark began, his tone careful. "That's not unusual, but there are a few things that caught my attention. She's been involved in a few business ventures before, all of which failed. It's strange because each of those ventures ended just before they were about to go under financially, but Emily always came out unscathed." Margaret frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying she has a pattern," Mark continued. "She gets involved with companies. Things go south, but she walks away clean. It's almost like she knows when to bail out before it all collapses." Laura's expression darkened. "That sounds calculated." "It is," Mark agreed. "I looked into the company David and Jason run. From the outside, everything looks fine, successful, growing, but there are inconsistencies in their financial reports. Nothing blatant, but enough to raise a red flag." Margaret's stomach churned with unease. "Are you saying David's company is in trouble?" "It could be," Mark replied. "Or it could be worse. Emily and Jason may be involved in something that David has no idea about. It wouldn't be the first time someone in a company was blindsided by their business partners." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. The thought that David could be unknowingly involved in something illegal or unethical was horrifying. But worse was the idea that he might be complicit, turning a blind eye to the truth. She didn't want to believe it. Her son wasn't like that. He wasn't a criminal. "So what do we do now?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "I keep digging," Mark said. "I've already reached out to a few contacts who can help me get a closer look at the company's finances. But Margaret, you need to be prepared for the possibility that David knows more than you think." Margaret shook her head, refusing to believe it. "No, Mark. David would never. He's a good man. He wouldn't get involved in something like this willingly." Mark gave her a sympathetic look. "I know you want to believe that, Margaret. And maybe you're right. But I've seen this before. Sometimes people get caught up in something they can't get out of, or they convince themselves that what they're doing isn't wrong." Margaret felt a cold pit form in her stomach. Was it possible that David had been swept up in something without realizing it? Or worse, had he knowingly allowed himself to be pulled into Emily and Jason's schemes? She couldn't bear the thought, but the nagging doubt refused to leave her mind. "I don't know what to think anymore," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I just want my son back." "We'll get to the bottom of this," Mark assured her. "But for now, it might be a good idea to keep your distance from David and Emily. If they're involved in something shady, it's better to stay out of their way until we know more." Margaret nodded slowly, though the idea of cutting off contact with David, even temporarily, filled her with dread. But Mark was right. Until they knew what was really going on, it was safer for her to keep her distance. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Mark left to follow up on his leads, and Margaret and Laura busied themselves around the house, trying to keep their minds occupied. But the tension was palpable, an invisible weight that hung over them both. That evening, as Margaret sat in the quiet of Laura's living room, she thought back to the days when David was a boy. He had always been so kind-hearted, so eager to please. She had never imagined that one day she would be sitting here, wondering if he had been drawn into something so dangerous, so corrupt. As the night deepened, the silence of the house began to feel oppressive. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened street. She wondered what David was doing at that moment. Was he at home with Emily, unaware of the investigation that was starting to close in on them? Or was he fully aware of everything, complicit in whatever scheme Jason and Emily might be running? The uncertainty gnawed at her, making it impossible to relax. Margaret turned away from the window and walked back to the sofa, sitting down heavily. She didn't know how much more of this she could take. This not knowing, this fear that everything she had believed about her son was wrong. But one thing was certain. No matter what Mark found, no matter what the truth turned out to be, Margaret would stand by David. She would fight for him, even if he had lost his way. He was still her son, and she wasn't going to give up on him, no matter what. Across town, David Johnson sat at his desk in the corner office of his company's high-rise building, staring blankly at the pile of papers in front of him. The glow of the city lights outside provided the only illumination in the room, as he hadn't bothered turning on the lamps when he arrived. It was well after business hours, but David hadn't gone home. He couldn't face the silence of his own home, or worse, Emily's presence. His mind raced, haunted by the events of the past few days. He couldn't stop thinking about his mother, Margaret, and the way he had dismissed her on her 80th birthday. Guilt gnawed at him, growing heavier with every passing hour. He knew deep down that he had crossed a line when he told her to enjoy the streets. He hadn't meant it, not in the way it came out. It was just the anger talking, the stress he had been under lately. But now, days later, the weight of what he had said was suffocating him. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as the memories of his mother's disappointed face flashed before him. The birthday he should have celebrated with her, the dinner she had undoubtedly spent hours preparing. It was all ruined because of him. He had let her down, but more than that, he had pushed her away. He had always been close to his mother. After his father passed away, it was just the two of them for years. She had raised him on her own, sacrificing everything to give him the best life possible, and now it seemed like all of that had been forgotten. David wasn't blind to the fact that his relationship with his mother had deteriorated since he married Emily, but he hadn't realized just how bad things had gotten until it was too late. A soft knock on the office door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Jason, his best friend and business partner, standing in the doorway with a casual smile on his face. "Working late again?" Jason asked, stepping into the office without waiting for an invitation. He sat down in the chair across from David, leaning back with the easy confidence he always carried. "You're going to burn yourself out if you keep this up." David forced a weak smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, I know. Just trying to catch up on things." Jason studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Something's bothering you," he observed. "You've been off for the past few days. What's going on?" David hesitated, unsure of how much to share. Jason had been his friend for years, but there were things David didn't feel comfortable talking about, especially when it came to his personal life. Still, the guilt that had been eating away at him since his mother's birthday was too much to keep bottled up. "It's my mom," David admitted quietly, looking down at the desk. "Her birthday was the other day, and I didn't even show up. I told her I was too busy, but that was a lie. I just didn't want to deal with the guilt trips. Emily was upset, and I let her talk me out of going. Now I feel like I've ruined everything." Jason raised an eyebrow, but didn't immediately respond. Instead, he leaned forward, folding his hands together as he thought for a moment. "Look, man, you can't beat yourself up over that. I get it. Family stuff can be complicated. Your mom's a tough lady. She'll bounce back." David frowned, not feeling reassured by Jason's words. "She's 80, Jason. She won't just bounce back. She's all alone. And I told her to go live on the streets." The words tasted bitter as they left his mouth, the shame heavy in his chest. Jason's eyes flickered with something unreadable for a moment before he shrugged. "It was a mistake, sure, but you can't change the past. What's done is done. She'll forgive you. She always does, right?" David wanted to believe that, but the doubt gnawed at him. This time felt different. This wasn't just a petty argument or a disagreement over something small. This was his mother's birthday, one of the most important days of her life. and he had treated it like it didn't matter. "I don't know," David said after a long pause. "I'm not sure if she will forgive me this time." Jason leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest as he regarded David thoughtfully. "You've got a lot on your plate right now. Running this company, dealing with Emily's issues. It's understandable that you'd be stressed out, but you need to focus on what's important, your future, this business. Family is important, sure, but you can't let it hold you back." David's stomach twisted at Jason's words. He knew Jason wasn't wrong. His company was his life's work, something he and Jason had built from the ground up. It demanded all of his time and energy, but it didn't make the guilt he felt any easier to bear. "I just need to fix things with my mom," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She doesn't deserve this." Jason nodded slowly, but there was a guarded look in his eyes. "Do what you need to do, but just remember, you've got bigger things on the horizon. This project we're working on, it's going to take this company to the next level. We can't afford any distractions right now." David forced a nod, though the words felt hollow. He knew Jason was right about the business. This project they were working on was the biggest thing they had ever undertaken. But at what cost? His relationship with his mother was crumbling, and the tension between him and Emily was growing by the day. As if on cue, his phone buzzed on the desk. David glanced at the screen, seeing Emily's name flash across it. He hesitated for a moment before picking up the call. "David, where are you?" Emily's voice came through the phone, sharp and demanding. "You said you'd be home by now. We need to talk." "I'm still at the office," David replied, his voice strained. "I've got a lot to do." "Well, you need to come home," Emily snapped. "We can't keep avoiding this conversation." David sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew exactly what conversation she was referring to, the constant fights they had been having lately about his mother, about the business, about everything. Emily was relentless, always pushing him to prioritize their future, their success, and he was starting to feel suffocated by it. "I'll be home soon," David muttered, ending the call before she could say anything more. Jason watched him carefully, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Trouble in paradise." David shot him a look. "I don't know what's going on with her anymore. She's been different lately. More controlling, more distant." Jason shrugged. "It happens. People change. Just make sure you stay focused on what's important." David nodded, but a sinking feeling settled in his chest. He had always trusted Jason. After all, they had been through everything together. But lately, something about Jason's attitude toward his personal life felt off, as if he was encouraging David to distance himself from everything that mattered outside of the business. As the evening wore on, David found himself sitting in his office long after Jason left, staring out at the city skyline. The weight of his guilt over his mother, the growing tension with Emily, and the unease he felt about Jason all swirled together in his mind, leaving him feeling more lost than ever. How had his life gotten so complicated? He used to know who he was, what he wanted, but now everything felt uncertain. His mother, the one person who had always been there for him, was slipping away, and he wasn't sure if he could get her back. David leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fix the mess his life had become, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he could. Margaret sat at the kitchen table in Laura's home, her eyes fixated on the delicate floral pattern of the teacup in her hands. She had barely touched the tea, its warmth long faded. Her mind was elsewhere, spinning with the recent revelations from Mark. Emily's suspicious past, Jason's influence on David. It all felt like a surreal nightmare. Could David truly be blind to what was happening around him? Or worse, was he somehow involved? Laura bustled about the kitchen, preparing a simple lunch, but she kept casting concerned glances at Margaret. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken worries. Finally, Laura set down a plate of sandwiches and sat across from Margaret, her expression softening. "Margaret, you've been quiet all morning. You haven't said much since Mark's last update." Laura's voice was gentle, laced with concern. "What are you thinking?" Margaret sighed, setting down the teacup and folding her hands in her lap. I'm scared, Laura. I'm scared that Mark's right, that David's caught up in something terrible, and I was too blind to see it. I don't know what to believe anymore. Laura reached across the table and took Margaret's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this. Margaret managed a weak smile, grateful for Laura's unwavering support. But the weight of the situation still hung over her like a dark cloud. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit by and watch her son's life fall apart. But what? Confronting David seemed impossible. He had made it clear he didn't want to hear from her, and after their last encounter, Margaret wasn't sure if she had the strength to face him again. The sharp trill of the doorbell interrupted their conversation. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, her mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario. Laura stood, glancing toward the front door. "That must be Mark," Laura said, heading to answer it. Moments later, Mark entered the kitchen, his expression grave. He nodded in greeting to both women before taking a seat at the table. "Margaret," he began, his voice steady, "I've looked into things further, and it's worse than I thought." Margaret's heart sank. She had been bracing herself for bad news, but hearing Mark confirm it still felt like a punch to the gut. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "What did you find?" "Jason and Emily are definitely up to something," Mark continued. "They've been moving large sums of money through offshore accounts, hiding their transactions. It looks like they've been funneling company funds into personal ventures, money laundering, possibly more." Margaret's stomach churned. "And David, does he know?" Mark hesitated, his eyes softening with sympathy. "I can't say for sure. From what I've found, David's name is on some of the accounts, but it's possible he's been kept in the dark. If he knows what's going on, he's being careful to stay out of it directly." Margaret's chest tightened. The thought of David being unknowingly caught in this web of deceit was bad enough, but the possibility that he was complicit, she couldn't bear it. "What do I do, Mark? I need to help him, but he won't even talk to me." Mark leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You need to warn him, Margaret. He deserves to know what's happening, even if he doesn't want to hear it. If he's innocent, he'll be in danger if this blows up. And if he's involved, well, he needs to know the consequences of that too." Margaret felt the weight of those words settle heavily on her shoulders. She knew Mark was right. David needed to hear the truth, whether he was ready for it or not. But the thought of confronting him, of seeing the disappointment in his eyes, terrified her. "How do I even begin?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "He won't listen to me. He hasn't been himself in so long. And Emily, she's got him wrapped around her finger." "You'll have to find a way," Mark replied firmly. "Get him alone, away from Emily and Jason. Speak to him honestly, from the heart. He might not want to believe you, but deep down, he knows who you are. You're his mother, and that still means something." Margaret nodded, though the fear gnawed at her insides. She had always been strong for David, always put on a brave face no matter how hard things got. But this was different. This was a fight for his future, his safety, and possibly even his life, and it all rested on her shoulders. "All right," Margaret said after a long pause, steeling herself. "I'll do it. I'll talk to him." Laura and Mark exchanged a glance, their expressions filled with concern, but also admiration for Margaret's courage. Laura stood and placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We'll be with you every step of the way," Laura said softly. "You don't have to do this alone." Margaret squeezed Laura's hand, drawing strength from her friend's unwavering support. "Thank you, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you." Later that afternoon, Margaret found herself standing outside David's office building, her heart pounding in her chest. The sleek glass facade of the high-rise towered above her, and for a moment she felt small and insignificant, like an intruder in her son's carefully constructed world. But she couldn't let that stop her. She had to get through to him. Taking a deep breath, Margaret stepped inside the building, making her way to the elevators. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls as she ascended to the top floor, her face etched with determination. She had to remain calm, composed, no matter how difficult the conversation might be. When the elevator doors opened, Margaret stepped out into the sleek, modern office space. The receptionist behind the front desk glanced up, a polite smile on her face. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked. "I'm here to see David Johnson," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "I'm his mother." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "Just a moment, Mrs. Johnson." Margaret waited as the receptionist made a quick call, and a few moments later, David appeared at the end of the hallway. He looked surprised to see her, and for a brief moment, Margaret thought she saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. But it quickly vanished, replaced by a mask of irritation. "Mom, what are you doing here?" David asked, his voice strained. "I'm in the middle of a busy day." Margaret's heart tightened, but she stood her ground. "We need to talk, David. It's important." David sighed, glancing at his watch. "Can't this wait? I really don't have time for this right now." "No, David," Margaret said firmly. "It can't wait. Please, just give me a few minutes." David hesitated, clearly torn between his frustration and the nagging sense of responsibility to hear his mother out. Finally, he gestured toward his office. "Fine, but make it quick." Margaret followed him into the office, her palms sweating as she sat down across from him. David closed the door behind them, then sat behind his desk, his expression guarded. "What's this about?" David asked, his tone impatient. Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "David, I know about the company. I know about Emily and Jason." David's eyes widened, shock flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" "I know they're moving money through offshore accounts," Margaret continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I know they're involved in something illegal. I don't know how much you know, but you need to understand. This is dangerous. You're in danger." David stared at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Mom, what are you talking about? You don't know anything about my business." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "David, please, listen to me. Mark has been investigating." "Mark?" David interrupted, his voice rising. "You're letting Mark get involved in my life now? I can't believe this. You don't know what you're talking about, Mom. Just stay out of it." Margaret's heart broke at his words, but she refused to back down. "I'm not staying out of it, David. I'm your mother, and I won't stand by and watch you get hurt." David's face flushed with anger, and he stood abruptly, pacing behind his desk. "You don't understand anything. Emily and Jason are my partners. They've been helping me build this company. There's nothing illegal going on." "David," Margaret said softly, her voice filled with sorrow, "I love you, but you're being blinded by them. You need to look at the facts. You're being used." David turned toward her, his eyes blazing with fury. "Get out!" Margaret froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "David, please!" "I said, get out!" David shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I don't want to hear any more of this. You're not welcome here." Tears filled Margaret's eyes as she stood, her legs trembling beneath her. She had come here to save her son, to protect him from the danger she knew was closing in on him. Margaret stood frozen in David's office, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a physical blow. She had come here hoping to save her son, to open his eyes to the dangerous game he was unknowingly caught in, but his reaction was far worse than she had anticipated. His fury, the venom in his voice as he told her to leave, it was as if the loving boy she had raised had been completely erased, replaced by a man she no longer recognized. "I don't want to hear another word about this," David continued, his voice now lower but just as sharp. He wasn't even looking at her anymore, his gaze fixed angrily on the window behind his desk. "You've done enough damage." Margaret's throat tightened. "David, I'm not trying to hurt you, I'm trying to protect you. Can't you see that?" "From what?" David snapped, finally turning to face her. "From my own wife, my best friend. You're being manipulated by Mark, of all people. I can't believe you'd come here with this." Margaret flinched at his words, but she refused to back down. "I'm not being manipulated. I'm trying to help you see what's happening right in front of you. Emily and Jason are involved in something illegal, and you're going to get caught in the middle if you don't do something about it." David shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You're wrong, Mom. You don't understand anything about my life, about my business. Emily's the best thing that ever happened to me. She's not doing anything wrong." Margaret's heart broke at his denial. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that he refused to acknowledge. But the walls he had built around himself were too high, too fortified by his loyalty to Emily and Jason. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Margaret said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not giving up on you. I won't let them destroy you." David's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Margaret thought she saw a glimmer of vulnerability in his eyes. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the cold, unyielding mask he had worn since she'd walked into the room. "Leave," he said, his tone final. Margaret stood there for a moment longer, her heart aching, but she knew there was no point in arguing with him now. He wasn't ready to hear the truth. Not yet. Without another word, Margaret turned and walked out of the office, her steps heavy with the weight of her failure. As she exited the building and stepped out onto the busy street, the noise of the city around her felt distant, muted. Her mind was consumed with the painful realization that her son was slipping further and further out of reach, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Back at home, Emily sat at the dining room table, scrolling through her phone. A glass of red wine sat untouched beside her, but her focus was entirely on the screen. She had been monitoring Margaret's movements ever since the old woman had stormed out of the house days ago. Emily had been prepared for something like this. Margaret's stubbornness was well known, and Emily had always known it would be a matter of time before she started poking around. But Emily was not one to leave loose ends. She had carefully constructed her life with David, positioning herself as the devoted wife and partner in his business. And Jason, her accomplice, her partner in the shadows, had been instrumental in ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Together, they had funneled money through David's company, moving it to offshore accounts, setting themselves up for a future far beyond the life David imagined they were building. She smirked as she read through the latest update from a private investigator she had hired weeks ago. The report confirmed that Margaret had spoken with Mark, the so-called retired detective. Emily had anticipated that move. She wasn't worried about Mark. He was nosy, sure, but he didn't have the resources to truly expose what she and Jason were doing, and by the time anyone figured it out, it would be too late. The sound of the front door opening caught her attention, and she quickly composed herself, putting her phone away just as David walked into the room. "You're home late," Emily said, her tone casual as she stood to greet him. David looked exhausted, his tie already loosened, his expression clouded with frustration. "Yeah, I stayed at the office to catch up on some things." Emily raised an eyebrow, sensing that something was off. "Everything okay?" David hesitated, running a hand through his hair before meeting her gaze. "Mum came by the office today." Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face neutral. "Oh, what did she want?" "She's been talking to Mark," David muttered, his voice laced with irritation. "She's convinced that you and Jason are doing something illegal." Emily's stomach tightened, but she forced a laugh, shaking her head as if the idea were absurd. "David, you know that's ridiculous. Your mother has always been overly protective, especially when it comes to your business. She doesn't understand how things work." David nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I know, but she's really convinced this time. I've never seen her like this." Emily placed a hand on his arm, her touch soft and reassuring. "She's worried about you. That's all it is. But you can't let her paranoia get in the way of what we're building together." David sighed, looking down at the floor. "I told her to leave. I told her she was wrong, but I don't know. She's my mom. You know, what if there's something I'm missing?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression calm, her voice soothing. "You're not missing anything, David. We've been open about everything from the start. Your mom's she's struggling to accept that you're independent now, that you don't need her as much as you used to. She'll come around." David didn't respond immediately, his gaze distant as he processed her words. Emily felt a flicker of unease. Margaret was getting too close. If David started to doubt her, if he began looking into things, everything she had worked so hard for could unravel. But Emily was nothing if not resourceful. She had a plan, one that would ensure Margaret wouldn't be a problem for much longer. Later that evening, after David had gone to bed, Emily slipped quietly into the guest room where she kept her personal computer. She locked the door behind her, sitting down at the desk as she powered up the laptop. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she drafted an email to Jason, outlining the next steps of their plan. Margaret had to be dealt with. She had become a threat to everything Emily and Jason had worked for, and they couldn't afford to let her interfere any further. It was time to take drastic measures. Emily stared at the screen for a moment before hitting send, her mind racing with the possibilities. They would have to be careful, of course. Nothing could be traced back to them. But Jason was good at what he did, and Emily had no doubt that together they could make Margaret's life a living nightmare. As she closed the laptop and stood to leave the room, a satisfied smile crept across her face. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let anyone, least of all Margaret, destroy what she had built. This was her life now, and no one was going to take it away from her. The pieces were already in motion, and soon Margaret would regret ever trying to cross her. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the sound of quiet conversation drifting from the kitchen. The weight of the previous day's confrontation with David still hung heavy in her chest, but she knew she couldn't afford to linger in her sadness. There was too much at stake now. She had to find a way to reach her son before it was too late. As Margaret made her way downstairs, she heard Laura and Mark talking in low voices. When she entered the kitchen, they both looked up, their expressions softening when they saw her. "Morning, Margaret," Laura said gently, sliding a cup of coffee across the table toward her. "You didn't sleep well, did you?" Margaret shook her head, sitting down at the table. "No, I kept thinking about David. He wouldn't listen to me, Laura. He's so angry, and I don't know how to reach him." Laura placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder, her eyes filled with sympathy. "It's not your fault. You did everything you could. Now we need to focus on the next step." Mark, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Margaret, I've been digging deeper into this situation. I know it's hard to hear, but I think you were right to confront David. What I've found so far makes it clear that Emily and Jason are involved in something dangerous." Margaret's heart sank. "What did you find?" Mark leaned forward, placing a folder on the table in front of her. "I got access to some of the financial records for David's company. It's worse than I thought. Emily and Jason have been siphoning money from the company for months, possibly even longer. They've been moving the funds into offshore accounts, making it almost impossible to trace. But they've made mistakes, small ones that I was able to pick up on." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Numbers, names, account details. It was all so overwhelming, but there it was, in black and white, the proof that Emily and Jason were stealing from David's company. And the worst part, David's name was on some of the documents, his signature stamped on contracts he probably hadn't even read. "He doesn't know, does he?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shook his head. "I don't think so. If he does, he's not directly involved. Emily and Jason have been careful to keep him in the dark, but they've been using his authority to sign off on things. It's possible David's just been too distracted to notice." Margaret's heart ached at the thought. David had always trusted Emily and Jason, always believed they were looking out for his best interests. But now it was clear that trust had been misplaced. Emily had manipulated him, twisted him against his own mother, all while stealing from him behind his back. "So what do we do now?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "How do we stop them?" Mark's expression darkened. "We have to be careful. Emily and Jason are dangerous, and if they realize we're onto them, they could escalate things. I've seen people like them before. They won't hesitate to protect themselves, even if it means hurting others. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. She had known from the beginning that Emily was cold and calculating, but hearing Mark confirm just how dangerous she was made it all feel more real. Emily wasn't just a manipulative daughter-in-law, she was a criminal, and Margaret was caught in the crossfire. "Do you think they'd hurt David?" Margaret asked, fear creeping into her voice. "I don't know," Mark admitted, his tone grim, "but we can't take any chances. Right now, we need to gather more evidence. Once we have enough, we can take it to the authorities and protect David." Margaret nodded, though her heart was heavy with worry. How much longer would David be safe? How much longer until Emily and Jason realized they were being watched? As they sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling over them, the sound of Laura's phone buzzing broke the tension. Laura glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's David," she said, her voice filled with surprise. Margaret's heart leaped in her chest. "David? What does he want?" Laura quickly answered the call, putting it on speaker so that Margaret could hear. "Hello, David," Laura said, her voice calm but wary. "Laura, is Mom with you?" David's voice came through the phone, tense and agitated. "Yes, she's here," Laura replied, exchanging a concerned look with Margaret. "What's going on?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before David spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I need to see her. I think I made a mistake." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "David?" she said, her voice trembling. "Mom, I'm sorry," David said, his voice raw with emotion. "I shouldn't have yelled at you. I shouldn't have told you to leave. I don't know what's happening anymore, but I think you might be right about Emily. Something's been off for a while now, and I've been too blind to see it." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she listened to her son's confession. After everything that had happened, after all the pain and anger, he was finally starting to see the truth. "David, it's okay," Margaret said, her voice soft and filled with relief. "We can talk about this. I just want to help you." "I don't know what to do," David admitted, his voice cracking. "I feel like I've lost control of everything. Emily's been acting strange, and Jason, I don't trust him anymore." Margaret's heart swelled with hope. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment David began to open his eyes to the reality of the situation. "Come over, David," Laura said, her voice firm. "We'll figure this out together." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before David finally agreed. "Okay, I'll be there soon." As the call ended, Margaret felt a surge of emotion welling up inside her. David had finally reached out. He had finally begun to see the truth. But with that realization came a new wave of fear. Emily and Jason were dangerous, and now that David was starting to doubt them, there was no telling what they might do next. "We have to be careful," Mark warned, his voice cutting through the moment of hope. "David might be coming around, but Emily and Jason won't go down without a fight. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Margaret nodded, her determination hardening. She wasn't going to let Emily and Jason destroy her son. Not now. Not ever. "Whatever it takes," Margaret said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. "We'll stop them." That evening, as the sun began to set, David arrived at Laura's house. He looked exhausted, his eyes dark with worry and guilt. Margaret rushed to him as soon as he stepped through the door, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, Mum," David whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I was wrong." Margaret held him close, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's okay, David. We'll fix this. We'll figure it out together." David pulled back, his eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "I don't know what to do. Emily, she's been lying to me, hasn't she?" Margaret nodded, her heart breaking for her son. "Yes, David, but you're not alone. We're going to stop her." As David sat down with Margaret, Laura, and Mark, they began to lay out the full scope of what they had discovered. David listened in stunned silence as Mark explained the details of Emily and Jason's scheme, the stolen money, the offshore accounts, the lies. By the time Mark finished, David's face was pale, his hands trembling. "I had no idea," he whispered, shaking his head. I thought they were helping me." "They were using you, David," Mark said gently, "but we can still stop them. We just need to act fast." David nodded, though his expression was still filled with guilt and disbelief. "What do we do?" Mark leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "We gather more evidence. We need enough to take this to the authorities. And we need to be prepared, because once Emily and Jason realize we're onto them, they'll do whatever they can to protect themselves." David's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he had arrived, Margaret saw a flicker of the old determination in his eyes. "I won't let them get away with this," he said quietly. "I won't let them ruin everything." Margaret placed a hand on David's arm, her heart swelling with pride. "We're with you, David. We'll face this together." As the night wore on, the plan began to take shape, but beneath the surface, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was looming on the horizon. Emily and Jason were dangerous, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. And Margaret knew, deep in her heart, that the fight was just beginning. The atmosphere in Laura's house was tense as Margaret, David, Mark, and Laura sat around the kitchen table, their plans laid out before them. David's face was pale, his hands clenching and unclenching as he processed everything Mark had uncovered. The stolen money, the offshore accounts, it was more than just betrayal. It was the realization that his life had been built on a foundation of lies, crafted by the very people he had trusted the most. "How could I have been so blind?" David muttered, his voice filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. Margaret reached over, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "This isn't your fault, David. You trusted them. Anyone would have." David shook his head, his eyes clouded with guilt. "But I should have seen it. I should have questioned things. Emily was always pushing me to focus on the business, to let her and Jason handle the details, and I just let them." Mark, sitting across from David, leaned forward. "That's what people like Emily and Jason do. They manipulate, they take advantage of trust. But now that you know the truth, you have a chance to stop them." David looked at Mark, his expression hardening with resolve. "What do we need to do?" Mark glanced at Margaret and Laura before speaking. "First, we need to gather concrete evidence, something undeniable that we can take to the authorities. I've already found some financial irregularities, but we need more. Emily and Jason have covered their tracks well, but they're not invincible." David nodded, though his face was lined with stress. "How do we get that evidence without them realizing what we're doing?" "That's where it gets tricky," Mark admitted. "We can't just barge in and demand answers. We need to play it smart, get them to slip up. They'll get careless if they think you're still on their side." David's expression darkened. "So you're saying I have to pretend like everything's fine, that I still trust them?" "For now, yes," Mark said. "If they sense you're suspicious, they'll tighten their grip, they'll go into damage control mode, and it'll be even harder to expose them. But if you play along, if you act like you don't know anything, we might be able to get what we need." Margaret watched her son closely, her heart aching for him. She could see the turmoil in his eyes, the struggle between his desire for justice and the pain of having to maintain a facade with the people who had betrayed him. "I don't know if I can do that," David confessed, his voice shaking. "Seeing Emily every day, knowing what she's done, it'll tear me apart." "You're stronger than you think," Margaret said gently, "and you're not alone in this, David. We'll be with you every step of the way." David glanced at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and regret. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. I should have listened to you sooner." Margaret smiled sadly, her heart swelling with both love and sorrow. "We'll get through this together." The plan began to take shape over the next few hours. Mark laid out his strategy. David would continue to act as if nothing had changed, giving him time to gather more information from inside the company. Meanwhile, Mark would work on the outside, following leads and digging deeper into Emily and Jason's financial dealings. Margaret and Laura would provide support, ensuring that David had a safe place to come back to while they navigated the dangerous waters ahead. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken fear that lingered in the room, a fear that Emily and Jason might strike before they could stop them. The next morning, David returned home to find Emily waiting for him in the living room, her face etched with concern. She was sitting on the couch, her phone in her lap, a glass of wine on the table beside her, though it was barely noon. "You were gone all night," Emily said, her voice carefully controlled. "I was worried." David's stomach twisted at the sight of her. He had spent the night at Laura's, poring over the details with Mark, but he knew he couldn't tell Emily that. He had to act as if everything was normal, as if he hadn't discovered the depths of her betrayal. "I needed some space," David said, his voice calm but distant. "I've been under a lot of stress with the business." Emily stood up, crossing the room to stand in front of him, her eyes searching his face. "You've been distant lately," she said softly. "Is everything okay?" David forced a smile, though his heart raced with the effort of maintaining the charade. "Yeah, I've just been thinking about the company a lot. We've got so much riding on this project." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded, her expression softening. "I know, and I'm here for you, David. You know that, right? We're in this together." David's stomach churned with disgust at her words. She was so convincing, so practiced in her manipulation. But he couldn't let her see the cracks in his facade. He had to play along, just like Mark had said. "I know," David replied, forcing himself to look into her eyes. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Emily." Emily smiled, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "We'll get through this, David, together." As she leaned in to kiss him, David's mind screamed with the knowledge of what she had done, the lies she had told, but he kept his expression neutral, his movements mechanical. He had to keep playing the part. Later that day, David went to the office, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every step. Jason was already there, sitting behind his desk, reviewing some papers. He looked up when David entered, flashing him a grin that now seemed insincere. "Hey, man, you okay? You've been off lately," Jason said, his tone casual. David sat down at his own desk, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just dealing with a lot right now." Jason leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp as he studied David. "Well, if you need anything, you know I've got your back. We're partners after all." David nodded, though his stomach clenched at the word partners. How many times had he trusted Jason without question, never once doubting his loyalty? And how many times had Jason lied to his face, all while stealing from him? "I appreciate that," David said, keeping his tone light. "We're in this together, right?" Jason smiled, though there was something cold behind his eyes. "Always." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork, but David's mind was elsewhere. Every conversation he had with Jason felt like a game, a careful balancing act between pretending to be the same man he had been and the growing anger that simmered just below the surface. By the time David returned home that evening, his nerves were frayed. He couldn't keep this up for much longer. Every time he saw Emily or Jason, he felt like he was walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from everything collapsing. As David walked into the house, he noticed that Emily wasn't in the living room where she usually waited for him. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. A sense of unease crept over him as he moved through the house, searching for her. When he reached the study, he found the door slightly ajar. David's heart raced as he pushed it open, revealing Emily sitting at the desk, her back to him. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on something on the computer screen in front of her. David's breath caught in his throat when he saw what she was looking at: financial records, encrypted emails, and account information that matched the documents Mark had shown him. Emily was covering her tracks, carefully erasing any evidence that could link her and Jason to the stolen money. David's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her, the reality of the situation crashing down around him. He had suspected the worst, but seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. Suddenly, Emily turned, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. "David," Emily said slowly, her voice calm but guarded. "What are you doing?" David's mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest. He had to think quickly, to say something that wouldn't tip her off. "I was just looking for you," David said, forcing a smile. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Emily studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she was searching for any sign of deception. But after a few seconds, she smiled and stood up, walking over to him. "You didn't interrupt," she said, her voice smooth. "I was just finishing up some work." David nodded, though his mind was already spinning, formulating the next steps of the plan. Emily was dangerous, and now that he had seen what she was capable of, he knew there was no turning back. The trap was closing, and soon there would be no escape. The days that followed were a blur of tension and careful maneuvering for David. He maintained the facade with Emily and Jason, pretending that everything was normal, all while working with Mark to gather the evidence they needed. Each day felt like a dangerous game, with every conversation and every glance between him and Emily carrying a weight of suspicion. But David wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. Emily, too, had become more guarded, her behavior more calculated than ever. She was constantly watching him, her eyes sharp, as if she could sense that something was off but couldn't quite put her finger on it. Jason, meanwhile, continued to act as if nothing was wrong, his usual charm masking whatever thoughts lay beneath. David knew they were both dangerous, but it was Emily who unnerved him the most. There was something cold and calculating behind her smile, something he had never truly seen before. He had loved her once, at least he thought he had, but now that love was twisted into something unrecognizable, poisoned by the knowledge of her deceit. It was late one evening when everything finally came to a head. David was sitting in his office at home, pretending to review company reports, when Emily appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed and a suspicious look on her face. "You've been distant lately," she said, her voice low but sharp. "Is there something you want to tell me?" David's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral. "I've just been busy with work," he replied, glancing up at her briefly before returning his attention to the papers on his desk. "You know how it is." Emily stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "It's more than that, David. I can tell when something's bothering you. You've been different ever since your mother came back into the picture." David felt a chill run down his spine. He had known this moment was coming, but he wasn't fully prepared for it. He had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. "I don't know what you're talking about," David said, standing up from his desk and crossing the room toward the window. He stared out into the darkened street, his mind racing as he tried to maintain the act. "My mom's not the issue here." Emily followed him, her voice growing colder. "Isn't she? You've been spending more time with her and less time focused on what's important. I thought we had a plan, David. I thought we were building something together." David turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. "We were," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "But things have changed. I've changed." For a moment, Emily's expression softened, her voice becoming more soothing. "David, whatever this is, we can work through it. We always have. You can't let your mother fill your head with nonsense. She's trying to drive a wedge between us." David clenched his fists, struggling to keep his anger in check. "This isn't about my mom. This is about you, Emily. I know what you've been doing. I know about the money, the offshore accounts. You and Jason—" Before he could finish, Emily's face twisted with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice rising as she stepped closer to him, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. "Everything I've done has been for us, for our future. You're just too blind to see it." David felt his breath catch in his throat. The mask was slipping, and for the first time, he saw the full extent of Emily's deception, the raw ambition and greed that had driven her to betray him. "You've been lying to me," David said, his voice trembling with fury. "All this time, you've been lying." Emily's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. "You're not innocent in this, David. You've been a part of it, whether you realize it or not. Those documents you signed, those deals you approved, they were all part of the plan. If I go down, you go down with me." David's stomach twisted with fear and rage. He had known that Emily was capable of deceit, but hearing her admit it so openly, so coldly, was like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just manipulating him, she was willing to take him down with her if it came to that. "I won't let you drag me down," David said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "This ends now." Emily's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You think you can stop me? It's too late for that, David. You're in too deep. And if you try to turn against me, I'll make sure you regret it." David's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of her threat hanging in the air between them. He knew that she was dangerous, but he hadn't fully understood just how far she was willing to go until now. She was a master of manipulation, and she had played him perfectly, but David wasn't the same man he had been a few weeks ago. He had seen through her lies, and he wasn't going to let her control him any longer. "I'm not afraid of you, Emily," David said, his voice firm. "You can try to scare me, but I won't back down. Not this time." Emily's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the cold, calculating expression that David had come to recognize. "We'll see about that," she said quietly, her eyes gleaming with malice. "But remember this, David, if you try to cross me, I won't just come after you. I'll come after your mother too, and I won't hesitate to destroy her." David's blood ran cold at her words, the full weight of her threat sinking in. He had always feared that Emily would go after Margaret, but hearing her say it so explicitly, so casually, made his heart race with panic. He couldn't let her hurt his mother. He couldn't let her destroy everything. "You stay away from my mother," David said, his voice low and dangerous. "If you lay a hand on her, you'll..." "What?" Emily interrupted, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're not in control here, David. I am, and if you want to protect your precious mother, you'll do exactly as I say." David felt his resolve harden. He had been playing along for days, pretending that everything was fine, but now that Emily had shown her true colors, there was no going back. He had to end this, once and for all. Without another word, David turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily standing there, her eyes burning with fury. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the garage, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. Emily had crossed a line, and now there was no doubt in his mind that she had to be stopped. As he climbed into his car and sped out of the driveway, David's mind was already working through the next steps. He needed to talk to Margaret. They had to act quickly, before Emily could do any more damage. But even as he drove through the darkened streets, a nagging sense of dread settled in his gut. Emily was dangerous. She had made that clear. And now, with her back against the wall, there was no telling what she might do. Meanwhile, Emily stood in the middle of the study, her chest heaving with anger. David had changed. He wasn't the weak, gullible man she had manipulated for so long. He was fighting back, and that made him a threat she couldn't afford to ignore. She grabbed her phone and dialed Jason's number, her fingers trembling with fury. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice casual. "What's up?" "David knows," Emily hissed, pacing the room. "He's on to us." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Jason spoke again, his voice calm but serious. "How much does he know?" "Enough," Emily replied, her voice tight. "We need to move fast. If he goes to the authorities..." "He won't," Jason interrupted. "Not if we handle this the right way." Emily paused, her heart racing. "What are you suggesting?" Jason's voice was cold, calculated. "We make sure David can't say anything, and we make sure Margaret stays out of the picture, for good." Emily's breath caught in her throat, a chill running down her spine. She had known that Jason was ruthless, but this was a step she hadn't been prepared to take. But as the weight of David's defiance settled over her, Emily realized that she didn't have a choice. If they wanted to protect themselves, they had to act, and they had to act now. "Do it," Emily said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "But make sure it's clean. I don't want any loose ends." Jason chuckled darkly. "Consider it done." As Emily hung up the phone, She felt a sense of finality settle over her. There was no turning back now. The game had changed, and it was time to eliminate the threats standing in her way. Margaret had always been an obstacle, but soon that obstacle would be gone. Margaret sat at the kitchen table in Laura's home, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as her mind wandered to the confrontation David had described the night before. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest after hearing what Emily had said, the threat she had made against her. It was clear now. Emily wasn't just a manipulator or a liar. She was dangerous. And with Jason backing her up, that danger had only multiplied. Laura sat across from her, her face etched with concern. "Do you think David's okay? After everything he told you last night, I can't help but worry." Margaret sighed, her eyes distant. "He's strong, but I don't know how much more of this he can take. Emily's not just playing games anymore. She's threatening him, threatening me." Laura reached out, squeezing Margaret's hand. "We'll protect him, and we'll protect you. Mark is on top of things, and once we have enough evidence, Emily and Jason will be out of our lives for good." Margaret nodded, though the pit in her stomach told her it wouldn't be that easy. Emily was smart, and she had covered her tracks well. The deeper Mark dug into her and Jason's schemes, the clearer it became that they were up against two people with no regard for anyone but themselves. Just as the thought crossed her mind, the front door opened and Mark entered, a serious look on his face. He set his coat down and joined them at the table, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," Mark said, his voice low. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Mark leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "I've been following Emily and Jason more closely over the last few days. They've been moving money faster, transferring it into more secure accounts. It's as if they know we're onto them." Margaret's blood ran cold. "You think they know what we're doing?" "I can't be sure," Mark said, rubbing his temples. "But it looks like they're getting ready to disappear. If they sense any more heat, they could take off with the money and vanish for good. And there's something else." "What?" Laura asked, her voice laced with fear. Mark hesitated, his gaze shifting to Margaret. "They're planning something more immediate. Jason's been making calls, dangerous calls. I think they're setting up a contingency plan in case things go south." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "You mean they're going to hurt David?" "I think they're considering it," Mark said grimly. "But they're more focused on you, Margaret. Emily sees you as the root of all this, her biggest threat." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Emily had always resented her, but hearing that she was being targeted made everything feel much more real. She had never imagined that the situation would escalate to this point, where her life and David's could be in danger. Laura's eyes widened with concern. "What do we do?" Mark took a deep breath, his expression serious. "We need to act fast. We need to get to the authorities with what we have, even if it's not enough to take them down yet. At the very least, it'll put pressure on them and give us protection." Margaret nodded, though the fear gnawing at her insides made it hard to focus. "What about David? He's still in the house with her. If she's planning something, I'll reach out to him," Mark said. "He needs to be careful, but he can't tip Emily off that we know what she's planning. If she feels cornered, she could lash out." The thought of David being in such close proximity to Emily, knowing what she was capable of, made Margaret's heart race. She couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "I'll talk to him," Margaret said, her voice firm. "I'll warn him." Mark nodded, though his eyes were filled with concern. "Be careful, Margaret. Emily's not playing by the rules anymore." Margaret stood, her resolve hardening. "Neither am I." That evening, David sat in his office at home, his mind racing as he stared at the documents on his desk. It had been only a day since his confrontation with Emily, but everything had changed. He could no longer look at her the same way, knowing what she had done, knowing how deep her deception ran. Every time she walked into a room, he felt the weight of her lies pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had tried to keep his cool, just like Mark had advised, but it was getting harder. Emily was growing more suspicious, and Jason was worse. There was a darkness in his eyes now that David hadn't seen before, a coldness that made his skin crawl. David glanced at his phone, debating whether to call Margaret or Mark. He needed to update them, to let them know that Emily and Jason were tightening their grip on him. But just as he reached for the phone, there was a knock at the door. "David," Emily's voice came through the wood, soft but sharp. "Can we talk?" David's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Yeah, come in." Emily opened the door, stepping inside with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She walked over to the desk, her movements smooth and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "You've been quiet," Emily said, her voice casual but laced with tension. "Is everything okay?" David nodded, though his throat felt tight. "Just thinking about the company. We've got a lot on our plate." Emily studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "You're not hiding something from me, are you?" David's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Why would I hide anything from you? We're in this together, right?" Emily smiled, but there was something cold in her gaze. "Of course we are, but you've been distant lately, and that makes me wonder if there's something going on that I should know about." David clenched his fists beneath the desk, the tension in the room growing thicker with each passing second. He had to be careful. Emily was testing him, searching for cracks in his facade. "There's nothing going on," David said, his voice steady. "I'm just stressed. You know how it is." Emily didn't respond immediately. She walked around the desk, standing behind him and placing her hands on his shoulders. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but it only made David feel trapped. "We're in this together, David," Emily whispered, her voice soft but dangerous. "Don't forget that." David swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't keep this up much longer. He needed to get out, to find a way to protect his mother and himself before it was too late. "I know," David said, forcing a smile. "I won't forget." Emily lingered for a moment longer before stepping back, her eyes still fixed on him. "Good, because I'd hate for anything to come between us." David nodded, his stomach churning as she left the room. The second the door closed behind her, he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She was onto him. He could feel it. His phone buzzed on the desk, and David grabbed it, relief flooding him when he saw his mother's name on the screen. He quickly answered the call, his voice low as he spoke. "Mom? David!" Margaret's voice came through the line, calm but filled with urgency. "You need to be careful. Mark's found something, Emily and Jason. They're planning something. They might try to hurt you." David's heart pounded. He had suspected as much, but hearing his mother confirm it made the threat feel all the more real. "I know," David whispered, his eyes darting to the door to make sure Emily wasn't nearby. "She's acting strange. She knows something's off." "We're going to the authorities," Margaret said, "but you need to get out of there. Don't give her a chance to trap you." David's throat tightened. "I can't just leave, Mom. If I run, she'll know for sure." "You don't have to run," Margaret said, "but you need to be smart. Don't let her corner you. Mark's coming up with a plan to get you out safely." David nodded, though fear gnawed at his insides. "I'll be careful. But, Mom, if anything happens..." "Nothing's going to happen," Margaret said firmly. "We're going to stop them, David. I promise." David's heart swelled with gratitude for his mother's strength, but the nagging fear remained. Emily and Jason were dangerous, and they were running out of time. As David ended the call and stared at the phone in his hand, he knew one thing for sure. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't act soon, it might be too late for all of them. The next few days passed in a haze of tension, each one more unbearable than the last. David was living on the edge, every moment in the house with Emily feeling like a dangerous dance where one misstep could send everything crashing down. He had become hyper-aware of her movements, the way her eyes followed him with suspicion, how her once comforting touches now felt like veiled threats. He kept his distance, careful not to show his hand, but he knew the clock was ticking. David had brief, secret phone calls with Mark, updates on the evidence they were gathering. Each conversation only confirmed what he already knew. Emily and Jason were dangerous, and they wouldn't hesitate to take drastic measures if they felt cornered. Emily had grown more paranoid. She started checking on David more often, asking him where he'd been, whom he'd spoken to. She even subtly questioned his loyalty, her voice always sweet, but the undertone unmistakable. "David," she asked one evening, as they sat in the living room, the TV droning on in the background, "you've been spending a lot of time away lately. Is there something going on that I should know about?" David kept his gaze on the TV, forcing himself to remain calm. "Just work. The project is more intense than I thought it would be." Emily leaned in closer, her hand resting on his arm. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" David felt his pulse quicken. He could sense the trap tightening around him, Emily's suspicions growing by the day. "Of course," he replied, glancing at her with a forced smile. "There's nothing to worry about." But they both knew that wasn't true. Later that night, when the house had finally fallen into a tense silence, David crept out of bed and made his way to the garage. He couldn't sleep. The weight of everything was pressing down on him, suffocating him. He needed to clear his head, to think about the next move. As he sat in the dim light of the garage, his phone buzzed. It was Mark. "David, we've got enough to go to the authorities," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. "But there's a problem." David's heart raced. "What is it?" "They're accelerating their plans," Mark explained. "Jason's been making calls, arranging something. I think they're getting ready to make a move against you and Margaret." David's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Are they planning to hurt her?" "I don't know the details yet, but they're being careful. Whatever they're planning, it's going to happen soon," Mark said. "You need to get out of there. You're not safe." David's mind raced. He had been trying to play it safe, to keep Emily and Jason from realizing that he was onto them, but now that seemed impossible. They were too close to making their move, and if they did, it could be catastrophic. "I can't just leave without tipping her off," David said, panic rising in his voice. "If I go, she'll know." "You need to play it smart," Mark insisted. "Pretend like everything's normal for now, but you have to get Margaret out of the house. We need to make sure she's safe first." David clenched his jaw. "I'll handle it. But if Emily finds out, she won't," Mark reassured him. "We're moving fast. The authorities are ready to step in, but we need you to keep calm until we have everything locked down. If you can get Margaret out quietly, we'll have a better chance of stopping Emily and Jason before they can do anything." David took a deep breath, his mind racing with the possibilities. "Okay, I'll figure something out." As he ended the call, David knew there was no turning back now. Emily and Jason were closing in, and the only way to protect himself and his mother was to stay one step ahead. The next morning, David carefully enacted the plan. He called Margaret under the pretense of a casual conversation, but his tone was anything but light. "Mom, I need you to leave the house today," David said, his voice low and urgent. "Just for a few hours. Go to Laura's. I'll meet you there later." Margaret's voice wavered on the other end. "David, what's going on? Are you in danger?" "I'm fine," David lied, his throat tight, "but I need you to be safe. Please, just do this for me." There was a long pause, and then Margaret finally agreed. "Okay, I'll leave in an hour." David's heart pounded as he ended the call. The plan was in motion. Now he just had to hold it together long enough to get out himself. That afternoon, Emily made an excuse to go out for a few hours, something about meeting Jason to go over final details for their next business venture. David knew better. He could see the gleam in her eyes, the way she was testing him, gauging his reaction. "Everything will be fine," David said, forcing a smile. "We'll handle it." Emily hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words, then nodded and kissed him on the cheek. "I know we will," she said softly, before slipping out the door. The second she was gone, David grabbed his keys and rushed to his car. He needed to get to Margaret before anything happened. He had told her to leave, but his fear was gnawing at him. What if Emily had figured it out? What if Margaret wasn't safe? As he sped through the streets toward Laura's house, David's mind raced. Everything had spiraled so far out of control, and now the consequences felt like they were closing in faster than he could handle. Emily and Jason weren't just criminals, they were ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to cover their tracks. And if they had any inkling that David had turned on them, there would be no limit to what they would do. Finally, David pulled up outside Laura's house, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed to the door, barely waiting for it to open before he stepped inside. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table with Laura, her face etched with concern. "David, what's going on?" Margaret asked, standing up as he entered. "Why did you want me to leave the house?" David exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he tried to calm himself. "Emily and Jason, they're planning something. Mark thinks they're going to make a move soon, and I can't risk you being in the house when it happens." Margaret's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "What about you? You can't go back there, David. It's too dangerous." David shook his head. "I have to. If I just leave now, Emily will know something's wrong. We need to keep playing along until Mark has enough to bring them down." Margaret stepped forward, her voice filled with worry. "David, I'm scared. I don't want to lose you." David's heart ached as he looked into his mother's eyes. He could see the fear, the love, and the desperation in her gaze, and it made his resolve harden. "You won't lose me, Mom," David said, his voice firm. "I'm not going to let them win." Just then, Mark entered the room, his face tense with urgency. "We need to move fast," he said, his tone serious. "The authorities are ready to move in, but we have to time it perfectly. If Emily and Jason realize we're coming for them before we're ready, they'll disappear, and they might take you down with them, David." David nodded, his mind racing. "I'll go back to the house. I'll keep them busy while you get everything set up." Margaret grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "David, please be careful." "I will," David promised, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'll come back. I promise." As David pulled away and headed for the door, he knew the next few hours would be critical. He was walking straight into the lion's den, but this time he wasn't afraid. Emily and Jason thought they had him trapped, but they didn't know that the walls were closing in on them. As David drove back toward his house, he felt the weight of the decision he had made. This was the final stretch. Either they would catch Emily and Jason in the act, or everything would fall apart. But David was determined. He had come too far, and he wasn't going to let fear hold him back anymore. He was ready to face whatever came next. David's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he drove back to the house. His heart raced, his mind swirling with everything that was at stake. Margaret was safe, at least for now, but returning home meant facing Emily and Jason head-on. He knew he had to keep up the act for just a little longer, until Mark and the authorities could move in. But the danger was real, and one wrong step could end everything. As he pulled into the driveway, David took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Emily's car was already there, parked neatly in its usual spot. The sight of it made his stomach churn, knowing she was inside, likely plotting her next move. Jason, too, would be lurking, ready to strike at any sign of weakness. David pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, the tension hanging thick in the air. He called out, his voice as calm as he could manage. "Emily." There was a pause, and then Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, her face set in a neutral expression. She descended slowly, her eyes locked onto him, studying his every movement. "You're back earlier than I expected," she said, her tone cool and measured. David forced a casual shrug, though his pulse was pounding. "Yeah, I finished what I needed to do. Figured I'd come home and take a break." Emily smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You've been busy lately," she said, her voice soft but laced with suspicion. "I was starting to wonder if there was something else going on." David kept his expression neutral, even as a bead of sweat trickled down the back of his neck. "I've told you, it's just work. You know how things have been lately." Emily took a step closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's not just work, David. I can feel it. You're hiding something from me." David's heart raced, but he stayed calm, knowing he couldn't let her see any cracks in his facade. "I'm not hiding anything," he said, his voice steady. "You're imagining things." But Emily wasn't buying it. She stepped even closer, her gaze piercing. "Am I? Because something's changed. I can feel it." David swallowed hard, his mind racing as he tried to deflect her suspicion. "Maybe you're just stressed," he said, forcing a smile. "We've both been under a lot of pressure." Emily studied him for another long moment, and then, to his surprise, she let out a soft laugh. "You're right. Maybe I am just stressed." Relief flooded through David, though he knew it was only temporary. Emily was a master manipulator, and he couldn't let his guard down for a second. As Emily turned away and headed toward the living room, David took the opportunity to slip into his office. He needed to keep his distance from her, to avoid any further probing questions. The last thing he wanted was for her to realize that he was working with Mark to bring her and Jason down. David sat at his desk, staring at the pile of papers in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. He had to stay focused to keep up appearances, but the tension was becoming unbearable. Emily and Jason were closing in, and there was no telling how far they would go to protect themselves. Just as David was lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "We're almost ready. Stay calm. Keep her distracted." David exhaled, his hands trembling slightly as he typed back, "I'm trying, but she knows something's off." Mark's response was quick. "Don't let her see that. She's dangerous, but we're closing in. Just a little longer." David set the phone down, his heart pounding in his chest. The pressure was mounting, but he had no choice but to see this through. Emily and Jason thought they had control, but they didn't realize the walls were closing in around them. Later that evening, David sat at the dining room table with Emily, the two of them eating in silence. The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken suspicions hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. David picked at his food, unable to stomach anything, while Emily watched him closely, her eyes flickering with something dark and calculating. "You've been distant," Emily said finally, breaking the silence. "Is everything really okay?" David forced a smile, though his heart raced. "I'm fine, just tired." Emily tilted her head, studying him. "You're lying." David froze, his pulse quickening as he tried to maintain his composure. "What are you talking about?" Emily leaned forward, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "I know you've been talking to your mother. I know she's been trying to turn you against me." David's heart pounded, his mind racing as he tried to think of a response. He couldn't let Emily know the truth, not yet. "That's not true," he said, his voice steady. "You're overreacting." But Emily wasn't buying it. She stood up, her eyes blazing with anger. "Don't lie to me, David. I'm not stupid. I've been watching you, and I know something's going on." David stood too, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to diffuse the situation. "Emily, you're being paranoid. I'm not turning against you." Emily's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "You think you're smarter than me. You think you can just play dumb and I won't notice. I know exactly what's happening. You've been plotting behind my back, haven't you?" David felt his blood run cold, but he kept his face neutral. "That's ridiculous." But Emily was beyond reason. She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're going to regret this." David's heart raced as she stormed out of the room, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. He could feel the noose tightening around him, and he knew the time was running out. Emily wasn't going to wait much longer to make her move. After dinner, David went upstairs to the bedroom, trying to gather his thoughts. He needed to stay calm, to keep his focus. Emily was dangerous, but Mark and the authorities were closing in. If he could just hold out a little longer, they would bring her and Jason down. But just as David was about to sit on the edge of the bed, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices, quiet but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. David's heart pounded as he crept toward the door, his pulse quickening with every step. He cracked the door open just enough to see Emily standing near the end of the hall. her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a low voice. "I don't care how you do it," she hissed. "Just make sure it's clean. I don't want any loose ends." David's stomach lurched as the full weight of what was happening hit him. Emily was arranging something dangerous, and it was clear that he was the target. David quietly closed the door, his hands trembling as he grabbed his phone. He quickly dialed Mark's number, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke. "Mark, it's happening. Emily's planning something. I just heard her on the phone." Mark's voice was tense. "David, get out of there, now." David's heart raced. "What about the authorities? Are they ready?" "They're moving in," Mark said, "but you need to get out before she does anything. She won't wait much longer." David swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had been holding out, waiting for the right moment, but now that moment had come. He had to leave, now, before it was too late. "I'm leaving," David said, his voice tight. "But I'm not going to let her get away with this." "David, just get to safety," Mark urged. "We'll take care of the rest." But David wasn't listening. He grabbed his jacket and crept down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily was still on the phone in the hallway, her back turned to him. This was his chance, his only chance to escape. As David slipped out the front door and into the night, he knew that everything was coming to a head. Emily and Jason thought they had won, but they didn't realize the trap was closing in around them. And David was ready to fight back. David's footsteps were quiet as he slipped out into the cool night air, his heart pounding with each step away from the house. His mind raced as he thought about Emily's call, the sinister tone in her voice as she ordered whoever was on the other end to make sure there were no loose ends. He knew now, without a doubt, that his life and Margaret's was in imminent danger. As he reached the car, David fumbled with his keys, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Emily hadn't noticed him leaving. The street was eerily quiet, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows along the pavement. His hands shook as he finally unlocked the car, slipping inside and starting the engine. He had to get out, get somewhere safe where Emily couldn't find him. But as the engine roared to life, David realized that safety was a fleeting concept. He couldn't hide forever. Emily and Jason had come too far in their plans, and they wouldn't stop until they had silenced him and anyone else who stood in their way. As he pulled away from the house, his phone buzzed again. It was Mark. "David, where are you?" Mark's voice came through the line, urgent but steady. "I'm in the car," David said, his voice shaky. "I'm leaving the house. She was on the phone, Mark. She's planning something. I don't know who she was talking to, but it's bad." Mark was silent for a moment, processing the information. "You did the right thing getting out. Listen, the authorities are preparing to move in, but we need more time. Can you stay somewhere safe for the night? We're coordinating with the police to make sure you and Margaret are protected." David's mind raced. "I'll go to Laura's house. She's with my mum, right?" "Yes," Mark confirmed. "She's there. It's the safest place for now." David nodded, though his grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white with tension. "I'll be there soon." As David drove through the empty streets, the weight of everything crashed down on him. How had his life spiraled so far out of control? The woman he had once loved was now plotting his demise, and the friend he had trusted with his company had been working against him from the start. Everything he thought he knew was a lie. And now, his survival depended on staying one step ahead of people who were willing to do anything to protect themselves. Meanwhile, back at Laura's house, Margaret sat anxiously by the window, her heart heavy with worry. She had spoken to David earlier, and while he had reassured her that he was okay, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Laura, ever the calming presence, sat beside her, offering quiet words of comfort. "It's going to be okay, Margaret," Laura said softly, placing a hand on her friend's arm. "David's strong. He'll get through this." Margaret nodded, though her mind was filled with doubt. "I hope you're right, Laura. I just can't believe how far this has gone. Emily, she's not the woman I thought she was. And Jason, I should have known something was off with him from the start. Laura gave her a sympathetic look. None of this is your fault, Margaret. You couldn't have known. But now we have to focus on what's next, making sure you and David are safe. Margaret sighed, staring out into the darkened street. I just want this to be over. I want my son to be free from all of this. Laura squeezed her hand. He will be. Mark's doing everything he can, and the police are involved now. Emily and Jason won't get away with this. But even as Laura spoke the words, Margaret could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. There was still so much they didn't know, so much that could go wrong. Just then, headlights flashed across the front of the house, and Margaret's heart leaped into her throat. She stood up quickly, fear gripping her. Is that David? Laura peered out the window, her eyes narrowing. It looks like it. Margaret rushed to the door just as David pulled into the driveway. She flung it open as he stepped out of the car, his face pale and strained with tension. David! Margaret exclaimed, rushing toward him. Are you okay? David nodded, though his eyes were dark with worry. I'm fine, Mom, but we need to stay on alert. Emily, she's planning something. I heard her on the phone. I don't know what it is, but we can't take any chances. Margaret's heart sank. What do we do? We wait, David said, his voice steady but filled with determination. Mark and the police are preparing to move in, but we need to lay low for now. I don't think Emily knows I've left, but we can't be sure. If she realizes I'm not at the house, she could come looking for me. Margaret exchanged a worried glance with Laura, her fear mounting. We'll be safe here, right? David hesitated for a moment before nodding. For now, yes. But we need to be ready for anything. As the three of them sat down in the living room, the tension in the air was palpable. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the danger that loomed over them, the possibility that Emily and Jason could strike at any moment. She knew her son was strong, but even he couldn't fight against the ruthlessness of the people who had deceived him for so long. Hours passed, the silence in the house broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the soft creaking of the floorboards as one of them shifted in their seat. Margaret's mind raced with thoughts of what Emily might be planning, whether she and Jason would try to run or if they were already making their move. Suddenly there was a loud knock at the door. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat, and she exchanged a fearful glance with David. Who could that be? She whispered. David stood up, motioning for them to stay back. I don't know. Stay here. He moved cautiously toward the door, his body tense, ready for anything. He reached for the doorknob, slowly turning it as he opened the door just a crack. To his relief, it wasn't Emily or Jason. It was Mark, standing on the porch, his face grim. We need to talk, he said, stepping inside quickly and shutting the door behind him. David's heart sank as he saw the look in Mark's eyes. What's happened? Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. We've got a problem. The authorities were supposed to move in tonight, but something's changed. Emily and Jason are onto us. They've accelerated their plans. We think they're going to try to leave the country. David felt his blood run cold. What do we do? Mark's expression was serious. We don't have much time. They've already started transferring more money into offshore accounts, and we have reason to believe they're planning to leave as soon as possible, but we've put surveillance on them. If they try to make a move, we'll know. Margaret's heart raced as she listened to the conversation, the fear gnawing at her insides. So, what does that mean for us? Are we still in danger? Mark turned to her, his expression softening slightly. For now, you're safe, but we can't let our guard down. Emily and Jason are desperate. If they feel cornered, there's no telling what they might do. David clenched his fists, the frustration and fear bubbling up inside him. We have to stop them, Mark. We can't let them get away. We won't, Mark assured him, but we need to play this smart. They're going to make a mistake. We just have to be ready when they do. As the night wore on, the tension in the house only grew. David, Margaret, and Laura remained on edge, their eyes darting to the windows every time a car passed by or a noise broke the silence. Mark stayed with them, his phone in hand, waiting for updates from his contacts in law enforcement. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one filled with the weight of uncertainty. But Margaret knew one thing for sure: this nightmare wasn't over yet. Emily and Jason were still out there, and as long as they were free, the danger remained, and the trap was closing in. The tension in Laura's house was suffocating as the hours dragged on. Margaret sat with David and Mark in the living room, all of them on edge, their eyes darting toward the front window at every little sound. It was past midnight, and the once comforting quiet of the suburban street had turned into an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of Margaret's neck stand up. Margaret clutched her hands together, her knuckles white as she tried to remain calm. Mark had assured her that the authorities were closing in on Emily and Jason, but with every passing minute, the danger felt closer. She couldn't help but think of all the things that could go wrong. Emily and Jason had been cunning from the start, and now that they were backed into a corner, they were more dangerous than ever. David paced the floor, unable to sit still. He glanced at Mark, who was on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones with his law enforcement contacts. "We need to know exactly where they are," Mark said, his voice tense. "If they try to move, we have to be ready." Margaret watched David as he paced, his face tight with worry. She could see the toll this was taking on him, the weight of the betrayal, the fear for her safety, and the uncertainty of what was about to happen. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but she knew those words would ring hollow. None of them knew how this would end. David's phone buzzed, and he quickly grabbed it. His eyes widened as he read the message. "It's Emily." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What does she want?" David hesitated before reading the message aloud. "She says she knows where I am. She says if I don't come back to the house right now, there will be consequences." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. What does that mean? What consequences? "She's bluffing," Mark said firmly, though his eyes flickered with unease. "She doesn't know where you are. If she did, she wouldn't be threatening you like this." David stared at the phone, his hands shaking. "I can't risk it, Mark. She's capable of anything." Mark placed a hand on David's shoulder, his voice calm but serious. "Listen to me. If you go back now, you're walking into a trap. Emily knows we're getting close to stopping her. She's trying to lure you back, to isolate you. We can't let that happen." David clenched his jaw, torn between the fear of what Emily might do and the need to protect his family. He knew Mark was right. Emily and Jason were desperate, and returning to the house would only give them the upper hand. But the thought of what they might do if they realized he wasn't coming back sent a wave of panic through him. "What do we do?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "We can't just wait for them to come after us." Mark nodded. "We need to get you both out of here. It's not safe anymore. Emily's threats are getting more specific, and if they're planning to run, they might try something drastic before they go." David looked at his mother, his eyes filled with concern. "Mum, we need to leave. Now." Margaret's stomach churned with fear, but she nodded. "Where do we go?" "I've got a safe location," Mark said, grabbing his keys. "I'll take you there. It's secure, and the police can meet us there. We'll keep you safe until they catch Emily and Jason." Without another word, they hurried to gather their things. David kept checking his phone, half expecting another message from Emily, but there was only silence. That silence was more terrifying than any threat she could have sent. As they rushed to the car, Margaret felt a wave of dread wash over her. She could sense the danger creeping closer, like a storm on the horizon. But she trusted Mark. He had kept them safe so far, and now they had no choice but to rely on him to get them through the night. The drive through the quiet streets was tense. David sat in the front passenger seat, his eyes constantly scanning the road for any sign of Emily or Jason. Margaret sat in the back, her heart racing as she clutched her purse in her lap, her thoughts consumed by fear. Every shadow on the road, every car that passed, felt like a potential threat. Mark drove quickly but cautiously, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. "We'll be there soon," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just stay alert." David glanced at him, his voice tight with worry. "What if they're following us?" "They're not," Mark replied. "I've been watching the whole time, but if they were, we'd know soon enough." Margaret's mind raced. She thought of all the times she had trusted Emily, welcomed her into the family, and now that trust had been shattered beyond repair. She had never imagined that Emily would turn out to be so dangerous, so willing to destroy everything in her path to get what she wanted. As they rounded a corner, David's phone buzzed again. He glanced down at the screen, his face going pale. "It's another message from Emily," he said, his voice strained. She says if I don't come back, she's going to hurt you, Mom." Margaret's blood ran cold. "She's lying," she said quickly, though her voice trembled. "She's just trying to scare you." But David's hand shook as he stared at the message. "She might be bluffing, but I can't take that chance." Mark's voice was firm as he kept his eyes on the road. "David, don't let her manipulate you. She's trying to rattle you. We're almost to the safe house. Once we're there, we'll have backup and we can figure out how to deal with this." David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't know what she's capable of anymore." "Neither do we," Mark said, his tone grim. "Which is why we're not going to play her game." They drove in silence for a few more minutes before pulling into a quiet, secluded area on the outskirts of the city. The house was tucked away behind tall trees, with no visible neighbors nearby. It looked unassuming, but Margaret could tell it was designed to be secure. There was a small gate at the entrance, and the area was well shielded from prying eyes. "This is the place," Mark said as he parked the car. "We'll be safe here until the authorities can move on Emily and Jason." David helped Margaret out of the car, his eyes scanning the area as they hurried inside. The house was simple but well furnished, with enough space for all of them to stay for as long as they needed. Mark quickly locked the doors and secured the windows, making sure everything was in place. Margaret sank into a chair, her heart still racing. "What happens now?" "We wait," Mark said. "I've got officers on standby. They're watching Emily and Jason, and if they make any moves, we'll know." David paced the room, his mind racing. "What if they try to run?" "They won't get far," Mark assured him. "The second they make a move, we'll be ready." But even as Mark spoke, Margaret could feel the weight of uncertainty hanging over them. They were safe for now, but for how long? Emily and Jason were desperate, and desperate people made dangerous decisions. Margaret looked at her son, seeing the tension in his face, the guilt and fear that had been weighing on him for so long. She reached out, taking his hand. "David, we'll get through this. I know we will." David squeezed her hand, his voice low. "I just don't know how this ends, Mom. I don't know what's going to happen." Margaret looked into his eyes, her heart heavy with worry. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." But as the night wore on and the quiet of the safe house settled around them, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. Emily and Jason were still out there, and the storm that had been building for so long was about to break. And when it did, none of them would be safe. The quiet of the safe house was unnerving. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle of the wind through the trees set Margaret's nerves on edge. She sat on the couch beside David, her hands fidgeting in her lap, her mind replaying Emily's threats over and over. The house was meant to be secure, but the fear that Emily and Jason could strike at any moment gnawed at her. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared at the floor. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived. His mind clearly consumed by the weight of what was happening. Margaret could see the guilt and fear etched in his face, the realization that his wife had turned into someone dangerous, someone capable of violence. Mark paced by the front door, his phone in hand, occasionally glancing at the window as if expecting something to happen. He had been in touch with his law enforcement contacts, coordinating the surveillance on Emily and Jason. But so far, there had been no word on their whereabouts. "They're being quiet," Mark muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Too quiet." David looked up, his face pale. What if they're making their move now? What if they're already gone? Mark shook his head. We've got eyes on them. They haven't left the city, but we can't underestimate them. Emily's been planning this for a long time. She's smart. Margaret swallowed hard, her heart racing as she thought about the lengths Emily had gone to keep her secrets hidden. She had manipulated David, siphoned money from the company, and now she was willing to hurt them both to protect herself. Emily was no longer just a threat. She was a ticking time bomb. Suddenly, Margaret's phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling her. She grabbed it quickly, her hands trembling as she looked at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "Come outside alone, or your son won't survive the night." Margaret felt her stomach drop, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at the message, her mind struggling to process what she had just read. David noticed her reaction and quickly leaned over. "Mom, what is it?" Margaret's voice trembled as she read the message aloud. "They want me to go outside, alone. They're threatening you, David." David's face went pale, and he immediately stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "No, you're not going out there. This is a trap." Mark quickly moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. "They must know where we are." "But how?" Margaret's hand shook as she tried to think. Maybe they followed us, or maybe they've been watching us the whole time. "They're bluffing," Mark said, his voice steady. "They can't get to us here. They're trying to rattle you." But Margaret wasn't so sure. Emily had been one step ahead of them from the beginning, and now the danger felt more real than ever. "What if they're not bluffing?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they're out there, waiting for me?" David grabbed her arm, his voice tight with urgency. "Mom, you can't go. We'll figure this out, but you can't walk into their trap." Margaret looked into her son's eyes, seeing the fear and desperation that mirrored her own. She knew he was right. Going outside alone was exactly what Emily and Jason wanted. But at the same time, if they were serious about their threat to harm David, she couldn't just ignore it. "I won't let them hurt you," Margaret said softly, her voice trembling. "And I won't let you put yourself in danger," David replied, his grip tightening on her arm. Mark stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "We're not playing by their rules. If you go outside, we lose control of the situation. We need to stick to the plan. The police will move in soon." Margaret's heart raced as she struggled to think clearly. The fear for her son's life clouded her judgment, and the desperation to protect him made her want to do anything to keep him safe. Another buzz came from her phone, and she looked down to see a second message. 5 minutes, or you'll regret it." Margaret felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. The countdown had begun, and she could feel the noose tightening around them. "They're giving us a time limit," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "I don't think we have much of a choice." David shook his head, his voice filled with frustration. "This is what they want. They want you to be scared, to do something reckless." "I know," Margaret whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "But I can't just sit here and do nothing." Mark stood by the door, his expression grim. "We need to hold our ground. If they think we're not going to budge, they'll be forced to show their hand. But if you go out there, Margaret, we lose any leverage we have." The three of them stood in tense silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Margaret knew that Mark was right, but the fear for David's safety was overwhelming. Emily had proven time and time again that she was willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted, and now she was pushing them to the edge. Margaret took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "What if I just go to the edge of the property?" she asked, her voice wavering. "Maybe I can talk to them, buy us some time." "No," David said firmly, his voice filled with panic. "I won't let you." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples as he weighed their options. "If you go, you're putting yourself at risk. We don't know what they're capable of right now, but if we hold out here, we have backup coming. The police are on their way." Margaret looked between the two men, her mind racing with fear and doubt. She didn't want to disobey Mark's advice, but the thought of staying inside, waiting for something terrible to happen to David, was unbearable. Before anyone could say another word, there was a loud, sharp knock at the door. David's heart raced as he quickly stepped in front of Margaret, shielding her from whatever was on the other side. "Mark!" Mark's hand shot out, motioning for silence. He pulled his gun from the holster on his belt, moving toward the door with deliberate caution. He placed his ear against the wood, listening for any sounds, but there was nothing, only silence. Another knock, louder this time, sent a chill through the room. Mark gestured for them to stay back, his face tense with concentration. Slowly, he turned the doorknob, opening the door just enough to peek outside. Margaret held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched Mark's face. His expression changed in an instant, shock, then fear. He slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. "What is it?" David asked, his voice tight with fear. "They're here," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're outside." Margaret's heart sank. Emily and Jason had found them. The game was over. "What do we do?" David asked, his voice trembling. Mark's jaw clenched as he glanced out the window. "We wait. The police are close. They'll be here soon." Margaret's hands shook as she stood frozen in place, the fear suffocating her. She had never felt so powerless, so trapped. Emily and Jason were right outside, and there was no telling what they would do next. As the minutes dragged on, the tension in the room became unbearable. Margaret clutched David's arm, her mind racing with terror. They were so close to being caught in Emily's web, with no way out. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside, growing louder as they approached the door. Mark raised his gun, his body tense, ready for anything. But before anyone could react, there was a loud crash, glass shattering, and the lights in the house flickered, then went out. They were plunged into darkness. The sudden plunge into darkness sent a wave of panic through the room. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as her hand instinctively gripped David's arm. The sound of glass shattering echoed in her ears, followed by an eerie silence that felt like the calm before a storm. David quickly stepped in front of Margaret, his body tense, shielding her from the unseen threat lurking outside. "What the hell just happened?" he whispered, his voice trembling but determined. "They cut the power," Mark replied, his tone low but urgent. He moved cautiously toward the broken window, his gun drawn, scanning the shadows outside. "They're trying to force us out, scare us into making a mistake." Margaret's heart pounded as her eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight filtering through the now shattered window. The room was bathed in a cold, pale glow, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with every flicker of her imagination. She could barely see, but she could feel the danger pressing in around them. Mark gestured for them to move to the back of the house. "Stay close. We're not safe here." David gripped Margaret's arm and guided her through the darkness, his hand steady despite the panic gnawing at him. Margaret felt his fear, but she also sensed his resolve. He was determined to protect her, no matter what. As they moved toward the kitchen, the air was thick with tension. Every step felt like a risk, every creak of the floorboards too loud. The house that had once felt secure now felt like a trap, and Margaret's mind raced with thoughts of what Emily and Jason were capable of. They were just outside, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their moment. Suddenly, there was another loud crash. This time from the back of the house. Margaret jumped, her pulse racing as she clung to David. "They're trying to get in," David muttered through clenched teeth, his voice filled with urgency. Mark cursed under his breath, his mind working furiously to come up with a plan. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. "They're going to breach the house any second." Margaret's heart raced. "What do we do? We're trapped." Mark glanced around, his eyes flicking between the front and back doors. "We need to find another way out. There's no time to wait for the police. They're still minutes away." David shook his head, his voice filled with frustration. "They'll catch us if we try to run." "We don't have a choice," Mark replied, his eyes locked on David. "We need to be unpredictable. If we can get out the side door, we might be able to make it to the car and escape before they realize we're gone." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, the fear of being caught overwhelming her. "But what if they're waiting for us outside? What if, before she could finish, another crash came from the back of the house, louder this time, closer. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the room, and Margaret knew they were out of time. "They're inside!" David shouted, his voice filled with fear. Mark grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her toward the side door. "Go, now!" "We don't have a second to lose." David followed closely behind, his heart hammering in his chest as they rushed through the small hallway that led to the side entrance. The darkness enveloped them, every step filled with the dread that they wouldn't make it out in time. Just as they reached the door, it burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that sent shockwaves through the group. Jason stood there, his face twisted in a malevolent grin. His presence filled the doorway, blocking their path to escape. He looked like a predator, his eyes gleaming with dangerous intent. Well, Jason said, his voice dripping with malice. "Where do you think you're going?" Margaret froze, her body paralyzed with fear. David immediately moved in front of her, his voice trembling but filled with anger. "Get out of our way, Jason." Jason's grin widened, his eyes flicking between David and Mark. "I don't think so. You see, we've got unfinished business." Mark raised his gun, aiming it directly at Jason's chest. "Step aside, Jason, it's over." But Jason didn't flinch. He took a slow step forward, his expression calm, as if he had all the time in the world. "Oh, it's far from over, Detective. You and your little team of heroes are too late. Emily's already taken care of everything." Margaret's stomach turned as she heard Jason's words. Emily. She knew this was Emily's plan, that every move Jason made was calculated to fulfill her twisted agenda, but hearing his confidence, the cold certainty in his voice, made it all feel so much more real. "We're not going to let you get away with this," David said, his voice filled with barely contained rage. "It ends tonight." Jason chuckled, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down Margaret's spine. "You really think you're in control here, David? You've been a pawn from the start. You don't even know the half of it." David's fists clenched, his jaw tightening as he took a step toward Jason. "Move!" Jason's grin faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." And then, before anyone could react, the lights in the house flickered back on, casting harsh, unnatural light across the room. In the sudden brightness, Margaret saw the full extent of the danger they were in. Jason's hand moved subtly to his waist, where a gun was tucked into his belt. Mark noticed it too, and his voice hardened. "Don't do it, Jason. You don't want to escalate this." Jason's eyes gleamed with defiance. "You think I'm afraid of you. You don't know who you're dealing with." And in that instant, all hell broke loose. Jason lunged forward, pulling the gun from his belt in a flash of movement. Mark fired his own weapon, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the small space. Everything happened in a blur. Margaret screamed. David shoved her to the ground, shielding her as chaos erupted around them. Jason staggered backward, clutching his shoulder where Mark's bullet had hit him. He snarled in pain, but the look of rage in his eyes only intensified. David scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding as he pulled Margaret toward the side door, shouting, "Go! Run!" Margaret stumbled after him, her legs weak with fear, but she forced herself to move. She could hear Jason's labored breathing behind them, hear the scuffle between him and Mark as they fought for control of the situation. But there was no time to think, no time to process the danger, only the instinct to survive. David pushed open the door, pulling Margaret outside into the cold night air. The sudden rush of wind and darkness hit her like a slap to the face, but she kept running, her mind focused on one thing, getting away. As they sprinted toward the car, Margaret glanced over her shoulder, her heart seizing in her chest. Jason was still standing, blood pouring from his shoulder, but he wasn't backing down, he wasn't giving up, he was coming for them. David yanked open the car door, shoving Margaret inside before climbing in himself. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, the adrenaline making every movement feel sluggish and frantic at the same time. Come on, come on," David muttered, his voice trembling with panic. Just as the engine roared to life, Jason burst through the side door, his face twisted with fury. He raised his gun, aiming it directly at them. Margaret screamed as the first bullet shattered the back window. David slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. Another bullet ricocheted off the side of the car, but they sped out of range before Jason could fire again. As the car raced down the dark, empty street, Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. They had barely escaped with their lives, but it wasn't over yet. The sound of the tires screeching against the pavement echoed in Margaret's ears as David floored the gas pedal. The wind rushed through the shattered rear window, sending shards of glass scattering across the back seat. Margaret clutched her seatbelt with trembling hands, her heart pounding in her chest as the reality of what had just happened washed over her. They had narrowly escaped Jason's ambush, but the threat still lingered. Jason wasn't the type to give up easily, and Margaret knew that both he and Emily were relentless in their pursuit of covering up their crimes. There was no telling what they would do next. David's face was pale, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Are you okay, Mum?" he asked, glancing at her briefly, his voice thick with concern. Margaret nodded, though her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm fine, just shaken up." "What about you?" David didn't answer right away, his jaw tight as he stared at the road ahead. "I'm okay," he muttered, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. He was barely holding it together, his mind racing with thoughts of what Jason and Emily might do next. As the car sped through the quiet streets, Margaret's phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw it was a message from Emily. "You can run, but you won't get far. This isn't over." Margaret's blood ran cold. Emily's words were like poison, dripping with malice. She quickly showed the message to David, her hands shaking. "She's taunting us," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "She knows we're still in danger." David's face darkened as he read the message, his jaw clenching in anger. "I'm not going to let her win," he said through gritted teeth. "We're going to end this." Margaret could hear the desperation in her son's voice, the need to protect her, to put an end to the nightmare that had consumed their lives. But she also knew that Emily and Jason were capable of anything, and they had already proven that they wouldn't hesitate to kill if it meant getting what they wanted. "Where do we go now?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling with fear. "We can't keep running forever." David glanced at her, his eyes filled with determination. "We're going to the police station. Mark said they'd meet us there. Once we have their protection, we'll be safe." Margaret nodded, though a nagging doubt gnawed at her insides. Would they really be safe, or was Emily too far gone, too dangerous to be stopped by the law? She had manipulated and deceived so many people for so long. Could anyone truly bring her to justice? As they drove through the deserted streets, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow, every passing car felt like a threat, and her anxiety grew with each passing minute. The events of the night had shaken her to her core, and she couldn't help but fear that this was just the beginning of something far worse. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, drawing closer with alarming speed. "David," Margaret whispered, her voice laced with fear. "Someone's following us." David's eyes flicked to the mirror, his expression hardening. "Hold on," he muttered, pressing down on the gas pedal. The car surged forward, the engine roaring as they sped down the road. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as the headlights drew closer. "Is it Jason?" she asked, her voice tight with panic. "I don't know," David replied, his voice tense. "But whoever it is, they're not backing off." The car behind them accelerated, the distance between them closing rapidly. Margaret's pulse quickened, her mind racing with fear. If it was Jason, they were in serious trouble. He was desperate, and desperate people did reckless, dangerous things. "Can we outrun them?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to try," David muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. He swerved the car onto a side street, trying to lose their pursuer, but the headlights remained close behind, tailing them relentlessly. Margaret's heart raced as she clutched the edge of her seat, her body tensing with each sharp turn. The car behind them suddenly swerved to the side, pulling up alongside their vehicle. Margaret glanced out the window, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Jason's twisted grin through the glass. He had his window rolled down, his eyes wild with rage and determination. David cursed under his breath. "He's trying to run us off the road." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the door handle, bracing herself for what was to come. Jason's car veered dangerously close, the side of his vehicle scraping against theirs with a loud screech of metal. David swerved, trying to maintain control of the car, but Jason was relentless. He rammed their car again, harder this time, causing the vehicle to swerve dangerously toward the shoulder of the road. "Hold on!" David shouted as he fought to keep the car from skidding off the road. Margaret clung to the seat, her knuckles white as the car jerked violently to the side. She could hear the tires screeching, feel the car lurching as David struggled to keep it on the road. Panic clawed at her throat, her mind racing with the possibility that they might not make it out of this alive. Suddenly, the road ahead opened up into an intersection, and David made a split-second decision. He veered sharply to the right, sending their car careening down a narrow side street. Jason's car, caught off guard by the sudden turn, skidded past them, his tires squealing as he tried to correct course. David didn't waste a second. He floored the gas pedal, speeding down the side street and putting distance between them and Jason. Margaret glanced over her shoulder, her heart still racing, but Jason's car was nowhere to be seen. David slowed the car slightly, his breathing heavy, his hands still gripping the wheel tightly. "I think we lost him," he muttered, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. Margaret exhaled a shaky breath, her heart still pounding in her chest. "What do we do now?" "We keep moving," David replied. "We're almost at the police station. Once we're there, we'll be safe." But as they turned onto the main road, a sinking feeling settled in Margaret's stomach. She knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jason might have been out of sight for the moment, but he wasn't the type to give up easily. They drove in silence for the next few minutes, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. Every shadow, every car that passed, felt like a potential threat. Margaret's hands shook in her lap as her mind replayed the events of the night over and over again. How had things spiraled so far out of control? Finally, the bright lights of the police station came into view, and Margaret felt a small sense of relief wash over her. They were so close to safety, so close to finally putting an end to this nightmare. But just as David pulled into the parking lot, the roar of an engine echoed from behind them. Margaret's heart dropped. She turned to look out the rear window and saw Jason's car speeding toward them, his headlights blinding in the darkness. David cursed under his breath, slamming on the brakes and throwing the car into reverse, but it was too late. Jason's car rammed into them with a bone-jarring impact, sending their vehicle skidding across the pavement. Margaret screamed, her body thrown forward by the force of the collision. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass filled the air as the car came to a screeching halt. For a moment, everything was still. Margaret's vision blurred, her head spinning from the impact. She could hear David groaning beside her, but her mind was too foggy to process what had just happened. And then, through the haze of pain and confusion, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Jason was coming. Margaret's heart raced as she struggled to unbuckle her seatbelt, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She glanced at David, who was slumped over in the driver's seat, dazed but conscious. "David," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "We have to get out of here." David groaned, his hand clutching his side as he struggled to sit up. "Mum." But before either of them could move, the car door was wrenched open, and Jason's cold, sneering face appeared in the doorway. "Going somewhere," he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen with fear. They were trapped. Jason's sneer cut through the darkness, and Margaret's heart seemed to stop in her chest. He stood in the doorway of the car, his eyes gleaming with menace. The bitter cold air rushed in around them, but all Margaret could feel was the suffocating weight of terror pressing down on her. David, groaning in pain, tried to sit up, but his body was still reeling from the impact. Blood trickled down his forehead, and his breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps. Margaret could see the desperation in his eyes as he struggled to protect her, but there was little he could do in his current state. Jason's voice was cold, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You didn't think you'd get away that easily, did you?" Margaret's hands trembled as she fumbled with her seatbelt, her heart racing as her mind frantically searched for a way out. She had never been this close to Jason before, never been able to see the full extent of his cruelty, the twisted satisfaction in his eyes as he loomed over them. She had always known he was dangerous, but now she could feel it in every bone of her body. Jason's gaze shifted to David, his lips curling into a sneer. "You always were the naive one, David. So easy to manipulate. Emily and I, well, we've been laughing behind your back for years. You really thought you were in control." David gritted his teeth, trying to push himself up despite the pain radiating through his body. "You're a coward, Jason. You always have been." Jason chuckled darkly, taking a step closer. "And yet here I am, with all the power, and what do you have? Nothing." Margaret's heart pounded as she glanced around, desperate for any chance to escape. They were so close to the police station, so close to safety, yet trapped in this nightmare with Jason towering over them. The headlights from the squad cars outside cast long shadows on the pavement, but there was no sign of help. No one had noticed what was happening in the darkness of the parking lot. Jason's eyes flicked toward Margaret, and she felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. "And you, Margaret, always meddling, always sticking your nose where it didn't belong. If you'd just stayed out of it, maybe this would have gone differently." Margaret's voice shook as she spoke, her hands still gripping the edge of her seat. "You can't win, Jason. The police are right here. They'll catch you." Jason smirked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Oh, I don't think so. See, I've always been good at slipping away. I just need to take care of a few loose ends first." David struggled to his feet, his hand clutching his side as he moved to block Jason's path. "You're not laying a finger on her." Jason's expression darkened, his voice filled with icy contempt. "You're in no position to make demands, David." In one swift movement, Jason grabbed David by the collar and slammed him against the side of the car. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of David, and Margaret screamed, her body frozen in fear as she watched the scene unfold before her. "Stop it!" Margaret cried, her voice trembling with desperation. "You don't have to do this!" Jason ignored her, his grip tightening on David's collar as he leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "You've always been weak, always letting other people control you. But now you're going to learn what it feels like to lose everything." David's eyes blazed with fury, but he was powerless to fight back. His body was weak from the crash, and Jason's grip was too strong. Margaret's mind raced. She couldn't just sit there and do nothing. She had to protect her son. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Margaret unbuckled her seatbelt and stumbled out of the car. Her legs felt weak, her body trembling with fear, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Leave him alone, Jason!" Margaret shouted, her voice shaking but resolute. "This is between you and me." Jason turned to face her, his eyes narrowing in amusement. "You really think you can stop me, Margaret? You're as delusional as David." Margaret's hands balled into fists at her sides, her fear transforming into something else, something stronger. She'd been terrified of Jason and Emily for so long, but now, standing there in the cold night air, she realized that the only way to stop them was to confront them head-on. She couldn't let them continue to control her life, her son's life. Not anymore. "I'm not afraid of you," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear pounding in her chest. Jason's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to her. "Maybe you should be." Margaret held her ground, refusing to back down. "You've ruined enough lives, Jason. It ends tonight." Jason's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with anger. "You don't get to decide when this ends." Suddenly, the sound of sirens cut through the tension. and Margaret's heart leaped in her chest. She turned to see flashing blue and red lights approaching, the squad cars finally noticing the chaos unfolding in the parking lot. Jason's face twisted in fury, his grip on David loosening as he realized the police were closing in. "This isn't over," Jason spat, his voice filled with venom. He shoved David to the ground and turned to run, his body moving swiftly toward his car. But before Jason could take more than a few steps, the police cars skidded to a stop, officers jumping out with their guns drawn. "Freeze! Don't move!" one of the officers shouted, his weapon trained on Jason. Jason hesitated for a split second, his eyes darting around as if calculating his chances of escape. But it was too late. The officers surrounded him, their voices firm and commanding as they ordered him to get on the ground. Margaret watched, her heart pounding as Jason finally dropped to his knees, his hands raised in surrender. Relief washed over her like a wave, her legs suddenly feeling weak as the adrenaline coursing through her body began to fade. David groaned, still lying on the pavement, and Margaret rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she helped him sit up. "David, are you okay?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with worry. David nodded weakly, wincing in pain. "I'll be fine. It's over, Mom. It's finally over." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she looked at her son, relief and exhaustion washing over her. She had been so afraid that they wouldn't make it, that Jason would take everything from them. But now, with Jason in handcuffs and the police securing the area, she could finally breathe again. As the officers led Jason away, his face twisted in fury, Margaret stood up, her body trembling with the weight of everything that had happened. She glanced over at David, who was being helped to his feet by one of the officers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that they had won. But as she turned to look at Jason one last time, her heart skipped a beat. There, standing just behind the squad cars, was Emily. Her expression was cold, her eyes locked onto Margaret with a look of pure hatred. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had forgotten. Emily was still out there, still dangerous, and while Jason was in custody, Emily wasn't about to go down without a fight. Emily took a step forward, her hands balled into fists at her sides. She was cornered now, and there was no telling what she might do next. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized the nightmare wasn't over yet. Margaret's heart raced as her eyes locked with Emily's. There, standing just beyond the flashing lights of the police cars, Emily looked more dangerous than ever. Her normally composed face was now twisted with fury and desperation, her eyes glinting with the cold realization that the walls were closing in on her. Jason was in handcuffs, the police were swarming the scene, but Emily wasn't done, not yet. David, still wincing from his injuries, was being attended to by paramedics. Margaret could barely focus on anything else. Her mind was consumed by the threat still looming in front of her. Emily was unpredictable, and Margaret knew that a cornered animal was the most dangerous of all. Emily took a step forward, her movements deliberate and calculated. There was a madness behind her eyes, but she remained eerily calm, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Margaret," Emily called out, her voice echoing through the parking lot. "Do you really think this is over? You think you've won?" Margaret stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Emily's words sinking in. But then she felt a surge of strength, a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She couldn't back down now. Too much had been lost, too much had been sacrificed. It was time to end this once and for all. Summoning all her courage, Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "It's over, Emily. There's no escape for you." Emily's eyes narrowed, a bitter smile spreading across her face. "You don't know anything, Margaret. You never did. You've always been a pathetic old woman, clinging to your son because you had nothing else. And now you've ruined everything." Margaret felt the sting of Emily's words, but she didn't let them pierce her. Instead, she stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I ruined everything. You betrayed my son. You stole from him, from his company. You tried to destroy our family." Emily laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "David was a fool. He let me and Jason handle everything because he wasn't strong enough to lead. I did what I had to do, and I won't apologize for it." Margaret's heart ached at the mention of her son, but she remained resolute. "And now Jason is in handcuffs, and you're about to follow him. It's over, Emily." But Emily's smile only grew colder. "You think some handcuffs and a few police officers will stop me? I've been 2 steps ahead of you this entire time. You don't even know what's coming." As Emily spoke, Margaret noticed something. The way Emily's hand hovered near her coat pocket. A sense of dread washed over her as she realized what Emily might be planning. Her eyes flicked toward the police, but they were still focused on securing Jason. Emily had gone unnoticed in the chaos. "Don't do this, Emily," Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly now. "It's not too late to walk away. Turn yourself in. You don't have to go down like this." Emily's expression darkened, and her hand dipped into her pocket. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She opened her mouth to call out to the police, but before she could, Emily pulled something from her coat, a gun. The cold steel of the weapon gleamed in the dim light, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Margaret's pulse raced, and she instinctively stepped back, her mind screaming for her to run, but she didn't move. She couldn't, not with Emily's eyes trained on her like a predator. "I should have done this a long time ago," Emily hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You've been in my way since the beginning. I'm not letting you take everything from me." Margaret's breath caught in her throat as the weight of the situation bore down on her. This was it, the final confrontation. There was no reasoning with Emily now. She had lost control, consumed by her own hatred and desperation. David, seeing the gun in Emily's hand, tried to get up, but the paramedics held him back, urging him to stay still. "Emily, stop!" he shouted, his voice filled with fear and anger. "Don't do this!" But Emily didn't even look at him. Her eyes were locked on Margaret, the gun steady in her hand. "Margaret," Emily said softly, almost mockingly, "say goodbye." Just as Emily's finger tightened on the trigger, the piercing sound of a gunshot rang out, echoing through the parking lot. For a brief, terrifying moment, Margaret's world spun, and she thought it was over. But then she realized she hadn't been hit. The shot hadn't come from Emily. Emily staggered back, her eyes wide with shock as her hand dropped to her side. The gun fell from her grasp, clattering to the ground. Blood seeped through her coat, and she collapsed onto the pavement. Margaret stood frozen, her body trembling as the weight of the moment sank in. She turned slowly to see Mark, standing with his gun still raised, his face grim. He had taken the shot. The police rushed in, securing the scene, but Margaret barely heard them. The world seemed to move in slow motion as she stood there, her mind reeling from what had just happened. Emily lay motionless on the ground, her face pale, her eyes staring blankly at the sky. The chaos of the moment began to fade, and all that was left was the deafening silence that followed the storm. David, ignoring the paramedics' protests, rushed to Margaret's side, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret nodded, though her body still shook. I'm fine," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Emily's lifeless body. "It's over, David. It's finally over." David held her close, his own body trembling with relief and exhaustion. "I thought I was going to lose you." Margaret closed her eyes, letting herself lean into her son's embrace, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting from her shoulders. They had been through so much, deception, betrayal, danger, but they had made it through, together. Mark approached them, his face still somber but relieved. "It's over," he said quietly. "Jason's in custody, and Emily, she won't hurt anyone anymore." Margaret nodded, though the reality of what had happened still hadn't fully sunk in. She had feared Emily for so long, but now, standing in the aftermath, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The nightmare was over. As the paramedics tended to David's injuries and the police processed the scene, Margaret stood by her son, her hand gripping his tightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that everything would be okay. The months of fear, the constant tension, the worry that Emily and Jason would take everything from them, all of it was finally behind them. David looked at his mother, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "Mom, I'm sorry for everything, for not believing you sooner, for letting this go on for so long." Margaret shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "You have nothing to apologize for, David. We're here. We made it. That's all that matters." David nodded, pulling her into another embrace. They stood there, holding on to each other as the chaos of the night faded into the background. The flashing lights of the police cars, the distant murmur of voices, it all seemed to blur into the periphery as mother and son stood together, stronger than ever. And as the dawn began to break on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the parking lot, Margaret allowed herself to breathe deeply, finally free from the shadows that had haunted them for so long. They had survived, and now they could begin to heal. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.